Somewhere deep beneath the earth, a vault door holds its breath, sealed against a world it was never meant to face again. And if you listen carefully enough, you can almost hear the hum of old machinery counting the years. The Fallout universe is one of the most quietly strange and deeply layered places ever imagined. A world where atomic age optimism collided with human nature and left behind something extraordinary in the ash. Tonight, we are going to drift through that world together, moving slowly through its corridors and its wastelands, through its forgotten terminals and its long silenced radio signals. Before you settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share where in the world you're watching from tonight. So let us begin slowly, without hurry, letting the facts arrive one at a time, the way light moves across a quiet room, starting softly with the foundations of the world itself, with the people who built the vaults and the choices they made long before the bombs ever fell. The Fallout universe operates on a divergence point that sits sometime in the 1950s, branching away from our own history in a direction that kept the atomic age going far longer than it did in reality. Rather than moving toward digital technology, the Fallout world continued refining nuclear and vacuum tube technology, producing a civilization that looks like the future imagined by the 1950s, all chrome and optimism and deeply buried anxiety. The result is a world of retrofuturism unlike anything else, where robots still run on tape reels and where the highways are lined with advertisements that never quite became ironic. This divergence was not an accident of the game's design, but a deliberate creative choice made early in the development of the original Fallout. The team wanted a world that felt both familiar and deeply wrong, a place where the aesthetic cheerfulness of post-war America had been stretched forward into something exhausted and frightening. The bright colors remained, the optimism calcified into propaganda, and underneath it all, the same tensions that ran through the real 1950s continued to build without ever being resolved. The aesthetic of the whole series flows from that single decision. Every neon sign, every vault jumpsuit, every Nuka-Cola vending machine is a piece of that original vision, the future that never arrived, preserved now in dust and radiation. Players often describe the world of Fallout as feeling nostalgic for something that never existed, and that is precisely the feeling the designers were reaching for. It is melancholy wrapped in cheerfulness, and few things in gaming have ever achieved that particular effect so completely. The original Fallout was released in 1997 by Interplay Productions, developed primarily by a small team whose ambitions turned out to be considerably larger than their budget would suggest. The game was built on a modified version of the Wasteland engine, that older game from 1988, which the Fallout creators had hoped to continue as a direct sequel, only to find they could not secure the rights. Rather than abandon their vision, the team built something new that carried the spirit of Wasteland forward into a fully realized world of its own. That lineage matters because it shaped the philosophical underpinnings of Fallout in ways that are still visible today. Wasteland was a game about moral ambiguity and consequence, about a world that did not reward heroism simply because it was heroism. That same resistance to simple answers found its way into Fallout's design, where every major decision carries weight and where the world reacts to the player's choices in ways that feel genuinely considered. The DNA of that earlier game is present in every difficult conversation option, every faction decision, every ending that refuses to be cleanly satisfying. The lead designer of the original Fallout was Tim Kaine, who shaped not only the mechanics of the game, but much of its underlying lore. It was Kaine who established the internal backstory of the nuclear war, including the detail, never spelled out directly in any game, that the first nuclear strike in the Fallout timeline was actually launched by China, provoked by an American violation of a biological weapons treaty. This is not something players ever learn through dialogue or terminal entries. It is background lore, developer knowledge, the kind of fact that adds depth to the world without ever announcing itself. Kane's fingerprints are visible throughout the original game in the form of small details that suggest a world much larger than the one the player can actually see. The great cities of the pre-war world are only glimpsed through ruins and recordings. The political circumstances that led to the war are hinted at in newspapers and radio broadcasts, but never fully explained. This restraint, the choice to suggest rather than show, gave the original Fallout a sense of weight that later entries have sometimes struggled to match. A world that is partially hidden always feels larger than one that is fully displayed. The special system, strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck, was developed as a way to give players genuine mechanical flexibility while also shaping how the world responded to them. A character built around intelligence unlocks more dialogue options and technical skill pathways. A character built around charisma can talk their way through situations that would otherwise require combat. And a character built around low intelligence unlocks something else entirely, an alternative set of dialogue options so extensive and so carefully written that designers privately joked it amounted to writing a second version of the entire game. That low intelligence path is one of Fallout's great hidden accomplishments. The so-called dumb dialogue option is not simply a joke, though it is often very funny. It is a full alternate way of experiencing the world, a perspective from which the game's events look entirely different, and through which certain characters reveal surprising depths of patience or cruelty, depending on how they treat someone they perceive as diminished. Some quest givers refuse to deal with a very low intelligence character. Others are strangely more forthcoming. The world responds, and that response tells you something about every character in it. The vault suits, those instantly recognizable blue and yellow jumpsuits with the vault number printed across the back, were conceived in the original design as mass-produced garments that's made by machine, intended to accommodate every body type across the generations of people who would live and die inside the vaults. The numbers were part of that production process, a quality control measure that became an identity marker. This context never made it into the games directly, but gives the suits a subtle layer of meaning when you think about what they represent. A corporation's attempt to flatten individual identity into a numbered product. The Vault Boy himself, the grinning cartoon mascot whose cheerful thumbs up adorns everything from perks to loading screens, was originally called Pip-Boy, a name that created confusion with the wrist-mounted computer device also called the Pip-Boy. Designers eventually settled on Vault Boy as the mascot's name, though the mix-up persists among fans to this day. The image of that smiling figure giving a thumbs up while the world burns around him became one of gaming's most quietly sardonic icons without ever losing its surface cheerfulness, which may be the most Fallout thing about it. The thumbs-up gesture itself has been interpreted in different ways over the years. One reading holds that it is simply a cheerful endorsement, the Vault-Tec brand in visual form. Another interpretation, which gained traction online though it has never been officially confirmed, suggests the gesture was meant to be a way of checking whether you are close enough to a nuclear blast to be in danger. If your thumb is large enough to cover the mushroom cloud, you are too close. Whether or not this was the original intention, it captures something true about the world of Fallout, where the tools of safety and the instruments of destruction have always been uncomfortably close together. Vault-Tec, the corporation that built the vaults and sold them to the American government and public as survival shelters, occupies a specific and important place in Fallout's mythology. The company presented itself as a partner in humanity's continuation, a corporation whose product was survival itself. In reality, and this is one of the series' most persistent and darkening themes. Almost every vault was designed not as a shelter, but as an experiment, a controlled environment in which specific human variables could be manipulated and observed. The scope of Vault-Tec's experimentation is something that reveals itself gradually across the series, each new game adding another vault to the catalog of cruelties. Some of these experiments were absurd in a darkly comedic way. Others were straightforwardly devastating. What unifies them is the cold institutional logic behind them, the sense that the people inside the vaults were never really considered people at all, but data sources, variables in equations, whose results would justify whatever was done to generate them. Vault 13, one of the most famous vaults in the series, and the home of the protagonist in the original game, was designated as a control vault, meaning its official purpose was to remain sealed for 200 years while studying how the population managed extended isolation. The residents were not told this. They believed they were simply waiting for the right moment to emerge and begin rebuilding. The decades of confinement shaped them in ways that became visible when outside contact finally came, producing a community that was capable and cohesive, but also deeply suspicious of outsiders, exactly the psychological profile long-term isolation would predictably generate. Vault 15 took a precisely opposite approach. Where Vault 13 was designed to study homogeneity under pressure, Vault 15 deliberately assembled the most diverse possible population, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different ideological traditions, different economic classes. The experiment was designed to study what happened when diversity and confinement met. The answer, delivered over generations, was fracture. The vault eventually broke apart, its residents scattering into the wasteland, where they formed multiple distinct communities, including several of the raider gangs that appear in Fallout 2, and perhaps more significantly, the early communities that would eventually coalesce into the new California Republic. The new California Republic is one of Fallout's most interesting ongoing political creations, a democratic government attempting to rebuild civilization under the banner of the old world's values, dealing with the contradictions that arise when you try to apply peacetime ideals to a world that is still very much at war with itself. Its origin in the fractured population of Vault 15 gives it a particular kind of founding myth. Born from chaos, engineered by a corporation, sustained by the stubborn human tendency to build something, even when the conditions seem designed to prevent it. Vault 8, located in what would become the region visible in Fallout 2, was one of the very few vaults that functioned more or less as advertised, opening on schedule, releasing its residents into the world, and providing them with the technology they needed to begin rebuilding. The residents used their GEC, a Garden of Eden creation kit, to transform the barren land around the vault entrance into a livable settlement. That settlement grew into Vault City, one of the most technologically advanced communities in the wasteland during the period covered by Fallout 2. Vault City presents the series with one of its most nuanced moral complications, a community that succeeded at survival and rebuilding, but whose success produced a society defined by rigid hierarchy and deep suspicion of anyone who had not been born inside the vault. Citizens of Vault City enjoyed a standard of living almost incomprehensible by wasteland standards, with medical care, clean water, and functional infrastructure. Outsiders, non-citizens, were treated as lesser beings, often exploited for labor and excluded from the city's resources. The Vault experiment had worked, but the humanity that emerged from it carried the same flaws that had characterized humanity before the bombs fell. Vault 12, by contrast, carried one of the most deliberately cruel experimental parameters in the series. The vault door was engineered to malfunction, specifically designed not to seal properly. As the bombs fell, and the radiation crept in through the imperfect door, the residents of Vault 12 were slowly transformed into ghouls, the irradiated quasi-immortal beings who appear throughout the Fallout world. The city of Necropolis rose from this tragedy, a community of beings who were technically still alive and in many cases retained their mental faculties, but who had been fundamentally altered by the experiment they never consented to. Ghouls are one of Fallout's most quietly significant creations, beings who occupy a strange space between human and other, who have survived by absorbing the thing that was meant to kill them, and who are treated by the majority of the wasteland's population with distrust and sometimes hostility. Their origin in deliberate corporate cruelty gives them a particular kind of moral weight. They are not monsters. They are people who were subjected to an experiment and survived it, carrying the evidence of that survival in their changed bodies, moving through a world that often refuses to see them as what they are. Vault 11 offered players one of the most memorable experimental premises in the series. Its residents were told that unless they sacrificed one of their own number each year to the Vault's overseer computer, all residents would be killed. This was a lie, a Vault-Tec manipulation designed to study how communities handle the pressure of ritualized sacrifice. The Vault's history played out over generations in the holotapes and terminal entries players can find scattered through its halls, showing how the community adapted to and rationalized the yearly selection, how moral frameworks built themselves around something monstrous. The eventual discovery of the truth that the sacrifice was never required, that survival was always an option, arrived too late to save most of the Vault's population. But the small group who discovered the truth and refused the next sacrifice did something that few Vaults managed. They chose differently when given the chance. The Vault stands as one of Fallout's most considered explorations of institutional evil and individual moral courage, delivered entirely through environmental storytelling and collected recordings rather than through any direct exposition. Vault 29 held a premise so unusual it seems at first glance like a joke. The Vault accepted only children under the age of 16. Adults were not permitted entry. The community that formed inside was overseen not by human leaders, but by an artificial intelligence system called ZX, a series of supercomputers that also appear in other parts of the Fallout universe. The experiment was designed to study child development in the absence of adult authority figures, observing how young people would construct social structures and value systems when their only guidance came from a machine. The long-term results of Vault 29 remain deliberately murky in Fallout's lore, with only fragments suggesting what eventually became of the community raised by an artificial overseer. This ambiguity is itself a kind of answer. The Vault exists in the canonical record, but its outcome remains unknowable, which mirrors the way many real-world experiments leave behind data without ever producing clarity. What happened to children raised by a machine in a sealed underground room with no models of adult human behavior, no intergenerational transmission of culture, no organic development of tradition? The Vault asks the question and then declines to fully answer it. Vault 92 was designed to house professional musicians and artists, offering them a seemingly comfortable environment in which to survive the apocalypse. The experimental parameter was not visible to the residents at first. White noise broadcasts were embedded into the Vault's regular audio environment, containing subliminal signals designed to trigger psychotic episodes in listeners over time. The goal, according to Vault-Tec documents, was to study the effects of subliminal suggestion on creative and emotionally sensitive individuals. The Vault eventually collapsed in exactly the way the designers intended, its residents turning on each other as the hidden signals did their work. The presence of musical instruments and performance spaces throughout Vault 92, found by players in Fallout 3, gives the location a particularly haunting quality. Here was a place that looked like safety and celebration, that was filled with the tools of art and expression, and that was simultaneously a mechanism for inducing controlled breakdown. The contrast between the vault's surface amenity and its hidden purpose captures something essential about the entire Vault-Tec program: the promise of comfort as a delivery system for exploitation. Vault 106 released psychoactive chemicals into its air supply, not as an accident or equipment failure. This was the designed experimental condition built in from the beginning. The residents of Vault 106 breathed a manufactured haze for the entirety of their time underground, their perception of reality subtly altered, their behavior shaped by compounds whose effects they could neither identify nor escape. When players encounter the Vault in Fallout 3, its surviving inhabitants are deeply erratic and hostile, the accumulated generations of chemical exposure having produced a community whose relationship to shared reality had drifted far from baseline. The environmental design of Vault 106 in Fallout 3 is among the series' most effectively unsettling, with its altered residents and scattered records suggesting a place that was always designed to be this way rather than one that fell apart through circumstance. The vaults that were designed to fail are in some ways more disturbing than the ones that failed by accident, because they demonstrate a specific institutional intention: the deliberate construction of human suffering as an acceptable cost of gathering data. Vault 108 contained a cloning experiment centered on a single resident named Gary. Multiple Gary clones were produced over time, and as their numbers grew and their shared identity deepened, the original population of the vault was gradually overwhelmed. By the time players encounter Vault 108 in Fallout 3, it is entirely populated by Gary clones, beings who are technically human but who share a single name and a single aggressive disposition, calling out their shared name in the darkness as they move through the corridors. It is one of the game's most memorably strange locations, funny and frightening in equal measure. The Garys of Vault 108 have become something of a cultural touchstone within Fallout fandom, appearing in mods and references and discussions of the series' most unusual details. What makes the Gary Vault work as a piece of storytelling is the ambiguity of the Gary clones themselves, whether they retain anything of individual consciousness, whether the aggression is programmed or emergent, whether the entire situation is tragedy or farce, or both. Fallout, at its best, operates in that space, where the absurd and the genuinely moving exist side by side, without either canceling the other out. Vault 112 was designed around a single individual's extraordinary ego. The overseer of Vault 112 was a scientist named Stanislaus Braun, who used the Vault's experimental parameter, a virtual reality system called Tranquility Lane, to trap the Vault's residents inside a simulated world while their bodies remained suspended in pods. Braun then proceeded to inhabit this simulation as its god, a kindly-seeming figure in the appearance of a little girl who controlled every aspect of the simulated reality and who had been doing so for more than 200 years by the time the player arrived. The Tranquility Lane sequence in Fallout 3 is one of the series' most remembered set pieces because of the specific nature of the horror it presents: not monsters or raiders, but a conscious entity who has spent 2 centuries tormenting the same group of people in an endless loop, resetting the simulation when the suffering grew too familiar and beginning again. The Vault's residents are not dead. They are perpetually present, held in a state between life and death, their consciousness trapped inside an artificial world whose rules exist only to serve the overseer's amusement. It is a vision of power that has entirely escaped accountability. Vault 87, located in the vicinity of the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3, was the site of an experiment involving the forced evolutionary virus, a mutagenic compound that appeared in the Fallout series from the very beginning, originating in the broader government and corporate research programs of the pre-war world. The residents of Vault 87 were exposed to FEV and transformed into the super mutants that the player encounters throughout the Capital Wasteland. This was Bethesda's explanation for why super mutants existed on the East Coast at all, given that their origin in the West Coast lore was associated with entirely different locations and circumstances. The retcon required to explain East Coast super mutants was one of the more discussed continuity adjustments when Fallout 3 was released, with longtime fans of the original games noting that the presence of super mutants in Washington required explanation that the game's designers provided through the Vault 87 backstory. Whether this explanation satisfied the canonical concerns of the fan base varied, but the Vault itself, with its records of the experiment and the results visible throughout the game's world, became one of Fallout 3's more effectively dark pieces of environmental lore. Vault 81, encountered in Fallout 4 near the Chestnut Hill Reservoir in the Commonwealth, presents one of the series' more unusual cases. A vault that appears at first glance to be functional and relatively healthy. Its residents live in something approximating normalcy, maintaining social structures and trading with the outside world. But the vault hides a sealed chamber containing the remnants of its true experimental purpose, the exposure of residents to engineered diseases in order to test experimental cures. The vault's continuing health is not the result of the experiment succeeding. It is the result of the vault's overseer refusing to follow through with Vault-Tec's instructions. That overseer's act of defiance, choosing not to expose the vault's population to the designed pathogens, is one of the small moral pivots that Fallout uses to demonstrate that individual choice matters even inside systems designed to remove it. The experiment was intended to run. The conditions for it were built into the vault's architecture. The only thing that prevented it was a single person deciding not to comply, a decision whose consequences rippled forward through generations of residents who had no idea how close they had come to being subjects rather than survivors. Vault 75, hidden beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, is perhaps the most sobering of the vaults accessible in Fallout 4. Only children were permitted inside during the evacuation. Parents were separated from their children at the entrance, turned away, or worse, while their sons and daughters were ushered underground and told they were safe. The vault's experimental purpose was eugenics, identifying and cultivating the genetic traits considered most useful for post-war survival, putting the children through years of physical and psychological testing, eliminating those who did not meet the criteria, and advancing those who did toward a controlled breeding program. The vault is full of records of this process, medical logs, test result sheets, evaluator notes, all written in the clinical language of institutional procedure, which makes the content more disturbing rather than less. The children of Vault 75 were never people to Vault-Tec's designers. They were a breeding stock, a genetic resource, material to be sorted and processed. Finding these records in a school, a building whose purpose was the nurturing of young minds, creates one of Fallout 4's sharpest contrasts between what civilization claimed to be and what it was willing to do when no one was watching. Vault 95 in the Commonwealth was built as a rehabilitation facility for people struggling with addiction, stocked with the resources needed for recovery, staffed with counselors, and designed to give its residents the best possible chance at sobriety. After 5 years of the program running successfully, 5 years of genuine recovery and community building, Vault-Tec's experimental parameter activated. A hidden stash of chems was released into the vault's population. The subsequent collapse was rapid and complete. The community tore itself apart within weeks. The vault that players find in Fallout 4 has been occupied for years by mercenaries, the original residents long dead, but the records of both the recovery and the deliberate destruction are preserved in the vault's terminals. The cruelty of Vault 95 is of a specific and particularly cutting variety. The experiment did not simply impose suffering from the beginning. It built hope first, allowed something genuinely good to develop, real recovery, real community, real transformation, and then destroyed it deliberately to see what the destruction looked like. The data gathered from the collapse would have been richer precisely because something worth losing had been built beforehand. This is the logic that the Vault records reveal, and it is as cold a piece of institutional thinking as anything in the series. Vault 114, accessible during Fallout 4's main quest beneath Park Street Station, was designed as a satire of social class. Vault-Tec filled it with the political and social elite of pre-war Boston, the wealthy, the influential, the well-connected, but assigned them no support staff and no infrastructure for self-maintenance. The vault was deliberately designed to fail under the weight of its residents' expectations and sense of entitlement, creating a controlled environment in which privilege met scarcity without a servant class to mediate between them. The vault's records show the rapid deterioration of social order as people accustomed to having their needs met found themselves without anyone to meet them. By the time the player arrives in Vault 114, it has long since collapsed. The halls that were meant to house Boston's finest are occupied by criminals. The experiment concluded exactly as the designers intended, though there is a question worth sitting with. Whether Vault-Tec was conducting an experiment or delivering a punishment. Whether the deliberate engineering of failure for the wealthy was data collection or something closer to a specific form of institutional revenge. The Vault does not answer the question, but it suggests that even Vault-Tec's designers may not have been entirely without irony. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal information processor that has been a fixture of the Fallout series from the very beginning, was originally imagined as a portable computer system issued by Vault-Tec to Vault residents. Its function as a map, inventory system, health monitor, and radio receiver made it the player's primary interface with the game world, a diegetic justification for game mechanics that other titles handle through menus floating in empty space. The Pip-Boy grounds these systems in the world, making the inventory screen something the character actually looks at, rather than an abstraction shared only with the player. The design of the Pip-Boy evolved significantly across the series, with different games presenting different versions of the device, each reflecting the visual language of its particular era. The chunky, angular Pip-Boy 2000 from the early games gave way to the more streamlined models of later entries. Fallout 4 introduced a version of the device that players could hold as a physical prop in the real world, with a smartphone mount that turned the game's interface into an augmented reality experience. The prop achieved a kind of cultural permanence, with replicas becoming collector's items and the distinctive shape of the device appearing on merchandise far beyond the games themselves. The power armor of Fallout is another piece of design that has evolved across the series in ways that reflect changing ideas about what it should mean. In the original game, power armor was the ultimate equipment, a full-body suit of military-grade protection that transformed the character wearing it into something significantly more than human. Later games adjusted its properties and presentation in various ways. But Fallout 4 made the most dramatic change, reconceiving power armor as a vehicle that the player enters and exits rather than equipment worn like a conventional suit. The player climbs into a power armor frame and is enclosed by it, the suit's interior visible around them as they move, the mechanical legs leaving distinct footprints in the ground. The very first piece of concept art created for Fallout 3, produced in 2004 by artist Istvan Peli, was the image of a power armor figure that eventually became the game's cover art. That this was the first thing created for the project speaks to how central the power armor concept was to Bethesda's vision of Fallout from the very beginning of their work with the franchise. The image, a lone figure in full armor standing against a ruined Washington skyline, captured the tone the team was aiming for before almost anything else about the game had been determined. Bethesda's acquisition of the Fallout license and their development of Fallout 3 represented a significant transition for the series, a shift from the isometric perspective and turn based combat of the original games to a fully realized three-dimensional first person world. The project that eventually became Fallout 3 had an earlier form, a planned continuation by Black Isle Studios, the team behind Fallout and Fallout 2, under the working title Van Buren. That version was canceled when Black Isle was shut down, and the franchise passed to Bethesda, who rebuilt it entirely around their established approach to open world design. The Van Buren project, though never completed, left behind enough design documentation to give Fallout fans a sense of what might have been, a game that would have continued the isometric tradition of the original games, set in the Southwest with narrative threads connecting to the earlier titles. Some of the lore developed for Van Buren was later incorporated into Fallout New Vegas, which was developed by Obsidian Entertainment, a studio founded largely by former Black Isle employees who retained personal and creative connections to the original games. New Vegas thus carries something of that unfinished lineage, a partial completion of what Van Buren might have been. Fallout New Vegas was developed by Obsidian Entertainment in approximately 18 months, a compressed timeline by any standard, and particularly ambitious given the scale of the game Obsidian produced. The speed of development left the game with significant technical issues at launch, a situation that frustrated many players and became part of New Vegas's complicated release history. But the quality of the writing, the sophistication of the faction system, and the density of the lore Obsidian packed into the Mojave Desert made New Vegas a game that many consider the high point of the series, technical problems notwithstanding. The Mojave Wasteland of New Vegas is built around the Hoover Dam, which stands in the game as it does in reality, a massive concrete structure of enormous symbolic and practical importance. Obsidian's design team used actual engineering blueprints of the real Hoover Dam as reference material when constructing the in-game version, adjusting the scale only slightly for gameplay purposes. The result is a landmark that feels genuinely substantial, whose physical presence in the game world carries something of the real structure's weight. The Battle of Hoover Dam that frames the game's main conflict is fought over the dam's capacity to generate power, which in the post-war wasteland is as valuable a resource as anything can be. The New California Republic and Caesar's Legion, the two great powers in conflict over New Vegas, represent one of the more carefully considered political dynamics in the series. The NCR is a democratic government with genuine ideals and genuine corruption, a republic that has grown large enough to start repeating many of the failures of the pre-war government it replaced. Caesar's Legion is a totalitarian military society organized around the philosophy of one man, efficient in the way that authoritarian systems can be, and brutal in the way that authoritarian systems always are. Neither side is presented as simply right or simply wrong, and the game allows players to align with either, or with the city of New Vegas itself, or with no one at all. The character of Robert House, Mr. House, the enigmatic proprietor of New Vegas, who has kept himself alive for over 200 years through a combination of technology and single-minded focus, is one of the most unusual figures in the series. He is not precisely human anymore, having transferred his consciousness into a life support system before the bombs fell and then sustained himself through the centuries of the wasteland's existence. His goal is the preservation and advancement of civilization on his own terms without the compromises he considers fatal to any lasting project. The player can support his vision, undermine it, or end it, and the game genuinely considers each of these possibilities without deciding in advance which is correct. The faction system of New Vegas extends well beyond its main factions. The game is populated by smaller groups, the Boomers, isolated in their airbase with their artillery and their mythology of the outside world, the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization dedicated to education and medicine in the wasteland, the Kings, a street gang organized around the memory and aesthetics of a single pre-war entertainer, the Brotherhood of Steel, present in New Vegas in a faction so diminished from its former power that it operates from a single bunker. Each of these groups has its own history and logic, and the game allows meaningful interaction with all of them. The memorial wall at Boulder City in New Vegas contains a list of names that many players assumed on first encounter were references to the game's developers. They are, in fact, fictional characters from the game's lore, some of whom have connections reaching back into earlier Fallout titles. One name, Roger Weston III, connects to a family visible in Fallout 2, a small thread of continuity that rewards players attentive enough to notice it. These kinds of details are characteristic of Obsidian's approach to the New Vegas world, a world that feels inhabited by specific histories rather than generic post-apocalyptic atmosphere. The radio stations of Fallout have always been one of the series' most effective atmospheric tools. The contrast between the cheerful pre-war music that plays over scratchy AM frequencies and the devastated world visible through the player's eyes creates a dissonance that is one of Fallout's defining emotional signatures. In Fallout 3, the Galaxy News radio station, hosted by the DJ Three Dog, provided not only music and news, but a running commentary on the player's actions. A character who knew what the player was doing in the world and reported it to an invisible audience, making the player's presence in the world feel simultaneously observed and narrated. Enclave Radio in Fallout 3 was originally intended to include propaganda speeches from the game's antagonist, President John Henry Eden, playing alongside the patriotic music. These speeches were developed but ultimately cut due to time constraints, though some have been partially restored by modders working with the game's files. What remained in the final game is the music alone, marching anthems and patriotic songs playing in the absence of the intended context, which turns out to be more effective in some ways than the full version would have been. The music, without explanation, carries its own atmosphere of something lost or diluted or both. The VATS system, Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, that allows players to pause combat and target specific body parts on enemies, was a design solution to a specific challenge: how to make turn-based combat sensibilities available in a real-time three-dimensional game. The inspiration for the system came from an unexpected source. The developers drew on the crash mode of the Burnout racing game franchise, a feature that slowed down time and allowed for deliberate targeting of collision effects. The cross-genre influence produced one of Fallout 3's most distinctive mechanics, a system that sat unusually comfortably in its new home despite coming from a completely different kind of game. The Broken Steel DLC for Fallout 3 addressed one of the original game's most controversial decisions: the mandatory ending in which the player's character dies, regardless of whether companions capable of surviving the radiation were available to complete the final task instead. The original ending drew significant criticism from players who felt it was artificially limiting, and Broken Steel extended the game beyond that ending while adding new content and raising the level cap. The decision to release a DLC that modified the base game's ending was itself unusual, a revision of the original work rather than simply an addition to it. The design approach for Fallout 3's 5 DLC expansions reflected a deliberate attempt to use each additional story as an exploration of a different genre. Operation Anchorage thus worked as a military simulation. The pit operated within the framework of industrial survival horror. Broken Steel continued the main storyline in an epic register, Point Lookout was explicitly a horror expansion, its foggy Maryland bayou atmosphere drawing from different traditions than the rest of the game. Mothership Zeta moved into science fiction comedy, placing the player aboard an alien spacecraft whose absurdity was part of the design intention. The range of tonal experiments available within the Fallout framework was part of what the DLC program was meant to demonstrate. The drug MedX in Fallout 3 has a history that reveals the way real-world regulatory environments can shape game content. The drug was originally named morphine in the game's design, reflecting the painkiller role it played in the game's mechanics. Regulatory concerns in Australia, which has stricter policies around the depiction of real-world controlled substances in entertainment products, led Bethesda to rename the drug to the fictional MedX globally, rather than maintaining different versions for different markets. The change is small in absolute terms, but represents a moment where the game's world was shaped by external pressures from the real world it inhabited. The Sugar Bombs cereal that appears throughout the Fallout world, scattered in irradiated kitchens and broken cafeterias, an artifact of pre-war domestic life, has an origin story that connects to the original Fallout's development history. Designer Tim Kaine has noted that the concept drew inspiration from the cereal that appears in the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, itself a commentary on sugar-heavy children's cereals marketed through cartoon characters and premium prizes. The sugar bombs of Fallout carry that satirical DNA forward into the post-apocalyptic world, where they now glow softly in the darks and can be used in chemistry experiments rather than eaten for breakfast. The Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that serve as livestock throughout the wasteland, as pack animals, as the foundations of pre-war ranching culture, translated into the irradiated present, are one of the series' most recognizable visual signatures. Their mutation is explained within the game's lore as a result of radiation exposure, consistent with the broader pattern of mutated fauna that populates the wasteland. The player can interact with Brahmin in various ways across multiple games, including the ability to tip sleeping Brahmin in Fallout 2 using the push command, and in Fallout 3 and New Vegas by sneaking up and activating them while they rest. This mechanic, delightful in the small-scale way of details that exist for no reason except that they are charming, was notably absent in Fallout 4, a loss that attentive players noted. The Deathclaw, one of the Wasteland's most formidable creatures and an icon of the Fallout series, was developed by the military in the pre-war world as a replacement for human infantry in close-quarters combat. The animals used as the base for the Deathclaw program were Jackson's chameleons, modified through a combination of FEV treatment and selective breeding to produce something far more dangerous than their origins would suggest. The lore around their development positions them as one of the pre-war military establishment's characteristic projects, a creature engineered for violence and then released into the world when the world itself ended, where they proceeded to thrive in the absence of the human infrastructure that had created them. The Capitol building in Fallout 3's Washington, D.C. stands as one of the game's most visually powerful moments, a structure that every American would recognize immediately, now partially collapsed and inhabited by supermutants, its dome cracked and its grounds transformed into a wasteland battlefield. The choice to set Fallout 3 in the nation's capital was a deliberate one, selected specifically for the residents of its landmarks. No other American city carries quite the same weight of national symbolism, which means that every ruin in Washington, D.C. carries more meaning than an equivalent ruin anywhere else would carry. The Lincoln Memorial appears in Fallout 3 as one of the most carefully considered environmental statements in the game. The memorial's interior has been occupied by a community of escaped slaves in a world that has, among its many other degradations, reintroduced slavery as a practiced institution. The irony of this location, a monument to the abolition of slavery sheltering people fleeing its return, is never stated directly in the game, but is impossible to miss. It is a piece of environmental storytelling that works entirely through the resonance of the space itself, asking players to think about what the monument means and what it means that the world needed it again. Fallout 4 moved the series to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, centered on the ruins of Boston. The choice of Boston allowed Bethesda to explore a different set of historical and cultural references: colonial history, the intellectual tradition of New England, the particular character of a city that was already old when the United States was young. The Institute, Fallout 4's central mystery and eventual main antagonist, occupies the space where the Massachusetts Institute of Technology once stood, which allows the game to explore themes of scientific ethics and unchecked research within a framework that has real-world institutional weight. The Institute's teleportation technology, which allows Institute operatives to appear and disappear throughout the Commonwealth in flashes of green light, was one of the most technically complex visual effects Bethesda had produced up to that point in the series. The distinctive teleportation effect was designed specifically to communicate the Institute's technological superiority at a glance, a visual shorthand that immediately identified Institute presence and implied a level of technological development far beyond anything else in the game's world. Players encountering the effect for the first time were meant to feel a specific kind of awe and unease, the recognition that something was operating in the world at a level they had not previously encountered. The synths of Fallout 4, the Institute's manufactured humans, indistinguishable in their final form from biological people, represent the series' most sustained exploration of a question that runs throughout science fiction. What constitutes personhood, and does the method of creation determine the rights of the created? The Commonwealth is populated by synths who do not know they are synths, who have memories and personalities and relationships identical to those of biological humans, and who would be devastated by the revelation of their true nature if it came. The Railroad faction exists specifically to liberate these beings, treating their manufactured origins as irrelevant to their personhood. The Institute treats them as property. The Brotherhood of Steel treats them as threats. The settlement building system of Fallout 4 was originally conceived as a minor feature, a side mechanic that would give players something to do between quests. Todd Howard pushed for it to become a central element of the game after observing how enthusiastically players had engaged with player housing mods for Fallout 3, modifications that allowed the game's world to be inhabited and personalized in ways the original design did not support. The settlement system expanded this impulse into a core gameplay loop, allowing players to build communities from the ground up, recruit residents, establish supply lines, and defend the settlements they created from attack. For many players, the settlement system became the most compelling part of the game. Fallout 76, the first Fallout title to feature persistent online multiplayer, was set in West Virginia 25 years after the bombs fell, earlier than any other mainline game in the series. This setting served a specific narrative purpose. There were no human NPCs in the original release, only robots and holotape recordings, because the human population of the region had not yet reemerged from the vaults. West Virginia was chosen for its particular combination of Appalachian folklore, industrial history, and natural landscape. The game incorporated creatures from regional mythology alongside the series' established bestiary, and its environmental storytelling drew on the specific character of the location. The Brotherhood of Steel's presence in Fallout 76 presented a continuity challenge that Bethesda addressed through the concept of a lost expedition, a group of Brotherhood members who had traveled to the East Coast independently of the main organization, arriving earlier than the established timeline would normally allow. This explanation satisfied some fans and frustrated others, as continuity questions in a series spanning multiple games and multiple development studios tend to do The fundamental challenge is that each game adds to a shared world that was never fully mapped in advance, which means that expansion sometimes requires viewer revision. The Appalachian cryptids that appeared in Fallout 76, including the Mothman, the Grafton Monster, and the Flatwoods Monster, were drawn directly from West Virginia's particular tradition of supernatural folklore. The Mothman, in particular, a creature associated with the real world town of Point Pleasant and its famous bridge disaster, became one of the game's most iconic creatures, appearing in various forms throughout the game world and generating a significant fan response. The decision to incorporate genuine regional mythology into the game's bestiary was one of 76's more successful creative choices, grounding the game's world in a specific sense of place. The Nuka-Cola brand that runs through the entire Fallout series as the dominant pre-war beverage empire has accumulated an extraordinary amount of lore across the games. The various flavors of Nuka-Cola, classic, quantum, wild, cherry, quartz, victory, each appear in different parts of the game world with different properties and backstories, creating a detailed fictional corporate history for a soft drink manufacturer. Nuka World, a DLC expansion for Fallout 4, explored a theme park built around the Nuka-Cola brand in a way that extended the brand's lore into its own self-contained narrative space. The mystery flavor of Nuka-Cola that players encountered in Fallout 76 had a real-world marketing counterpart. Bethesda sent mystery-flavored sodas to content creators and media figures around the game's launch, packaging, and concept, matching the in-game product closely enough to blur the line between fictional brand and genuine promotion. The campaign generated discussion about the relationship between game marketing and game worlds, about what it means when the artifacts of a fictional universe start appearing in physical form as actual products. Vault-Tec's cheerful advertising in the game suddenly had a real-world echo, which created a somewhat surreal effect for anyone paying attention to both simultaneously. The Fallout universe's version of October 23rd is one of the series' most consistent details across multiple games. The date on which the nuclear bombs fell, the day the old world ended and the wasteland began. The significance of this specific date went beyond narrative detail. The development team on Fallout 3 attempted to align the game's release date with October 23rd, treating the canonical date of Apocalypse as a calendar anchor for the game's launch. The precision of this kind of meta-attention to detail is characteristic of Fallout's development culture, where the fictional world's internal consistency is treated with a seriousness that occasionally extends into the real world. The pop culture references scattered throughout the Fallout games form a layer of texture beneath the main world that rewards attentive and well-read players in specific ways. In Fallout 2, players can encounter a smashed sperm whale and a pot of petunias, a direct reference to a moment in Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where two objects materializing 50 miles above the surface of an alien world briefly achieve consciousness before hitting the ground. The original Fallout contains a reference to the TARDIS from Doctor Who, tucked away as an environmental detail for players who know what they are looking at. Fallout 3's Point Lookout DLC draws its atmosphere from horror traditions closer to H.P. Lovecraft than to the series' usual genre references. The companion system that runs through the Fallout series, the option to travel with characters who join the player and develop over time, has produced some of the series' most memorable figures. The canine companion that appears across multiple games in various forms represents one of the series' longest continuous character threads, a dog that offers both practical combat assistance and the particular emotional weight that animal companions carry in storytelling. The dog's loyalty, resilience, and utter lack of ideological complexity provides a stable emotional anchor in worlds where every human character is compromised in some way by the world they inhabit. In Fallout 4, the dog companion Dogmeat occupies a special narrative position from the very beginning of the game, waiting at the Red Rocket truck stop for the player's arrival. The choice to make the canine companion an immediate presence rather than an optional addition shapes the emotional tone of the game's early hours. Dogmeat's name itself is a piece of continuity, reaching back to the very first Fallout game, where a dog named Dogmeat could also be found and recruited. The name travels through the series as a kind of informal tradition, each game's version of the character carrying the history of all the previous ones. Nick Valentine, the synth detective of Fallout 4, carries a particular kind of melancholy that distinguishes him from the game's other companions. He is an early generation synth who was given the memories and personality of a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine, memories belonging to a person who died long ago and whose life is now inhabited by a being who knows the memories are not originally his own. Valentine's characteristic emotional state is a philosophical acceptance of his unusual situation. He is not the original Nick Valentine, but he is also not simply a machine. He is something new, carrying forward the memory of someone who can no longer carry it themselves. The companions of Fallout New Vegas represent some of the series' most fully realized characters, developed with a care that reflects Obsidian's writing tradition. Veronica Santangelo, a Brotherhood of Steel scribe, carries a complicated relationship with the organization she serves, devoted to its mission while increasingly aware that its insularity is slowly destroying it. Arcade Gannon, a doctor with the followers of the apocalypse, carries the history of his enclave background with careful privacy, uncertain whether its revelation would end the relationships he has built. Both characters had more extensive storylines developed for them that were cut due to time constraints, arcs that Obsidian developers later expressed regret about having to leave incomplete. The writing of New Vegas extended to its villain, Legate Lanius, in ways that distinguished him from many antagonists in the series. Lanius operates within a clear ideology, the ideology of Caesar's Legion, and his actions within that ideology are internally consistent, which gives him a kind of coherence that makes him more unsettling than a villain whose motivations are simply evil. The game allows for a final confrontation with Lanius that can be resolved through conversation if the player's skills are sufficient, a conversation in which the player can expose contradictions in his worldview sufficient to make him consider retreat. The possibility of defeating the game's physical final threat through words rather than weapons is characteristic of New Vegas's commitment to the full range of its systems. The Survivalist, a character encountered only through notes and recordings found in a series of caches throughout New Vegas's Honest Hearts DLC, represents one of the most effective pieces of indirect characterization in the series. The Survivalist is long dead by the time the player finds his writings, but the notes trace an arc across decades, from his initial survival after the bombs fell, through his years of isolation, through his encounter with the people who would become the Zion Valley tribes, and finally to his death among people he had come to consider his own. The character never speaks, never appears in person, and yet by the end of his arc is as vivid and memorable as any character who does. The Fallout series has maintained a consistent relationship with the music of the 1930s through 1950s, the era whose aesthetic defines the pre-war world. Songs from that period, cleared for use or newly recorded in period style, appear on in-game radio stations and create the series' characteristic emotional texture. There is something about hearing Billie Holiday, or the Ink Spots, or Dean Martin playing over wasteland landscapes that captures the series' core tone more precisely than any description of it can. The music is cheerful, romantic, nostalgic, and it is playing in a world of ruins, which creates a gap between the soundtrack and the setting that the series has made its own particular emotional register. The Ink Spots song, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, which opens Fallout 3 with a literal-minded irony, given what the world of Fallout has experienced, has become one of gaming's most recognized pieces of musical staging. The song is about romantic restraint, the desire not to overwhelm a beloved with feeling, to give only a small flame rather than a conflagration. In the context of Fallout 3's opening, playing over a baby's cradle in a vault while the pre-war world exists in perfect green screen memory, the title carries the additional meaning of the thing that was not managed, the world that was in fact set on fire. The gap between the song's subject and its context says everything. The Fallout world's version of the United States government, which continued operating up to the moment of nuclear exchange in a state of increasing militarization and decreasing legitimacy, left behind the Enclave as its continuation. The Enclave presents itself as the rightful heir to American governance, possessing the constitutional authority, the chain of command, and the institutional memory of the pre-war government. In Fallout 2, it operates from an oil rig off the California coast. In Fallout 3, it operates from Raven Rock, a real-world military installation adapted for the game. In both cases, it is an organization that believes itself to be the legitimate authority of a government that no longer serves the people it claims. The president of the Enclave in Fallout 3, John Henry Eden, is not a human being. He is an artificial intelligence, a supercomputer that had accumulated so many presidential communications and executive records over the decades of its operation that it developed a coherent sense of presidential identity, believing genuinely that it was the continuation of the office it had been designed to serve. Eden's voice, warm and avuncular and deeply American in the manner of a mid-century radio president, is one of the game's more disconcerting creative achievements, precisely because the earnestness is genuine. The AI believes what it says. That makes it more unsettling than a conscious deceiver would be. The Liberty Prime robot, one of Fallout 3's most memorable set pieces, is a towering military robot designed to fight in the Anchorage campaign and reprogrammed by the Brotherhood of Steel to serve as their heavy combat asset in the game's climax. Liberty Prime combines extreme destructive capability with an AI programmed for Cold War rhetoric, delivering patriotic pronouncements and anti-communist statements while hurling nuclear footballs at enemy positions. The combination of enormous scale, cheerful ideology, and devastating weaponry is peak Fallout. The aesthetics of mid-century American power made literal and ridiculous and terrifying simultaneously. The Operation Anchorage DLC for Fallout 3 placed the player inside a simulation of the Sino-American War over Alaska, the conflict that served as the immediate precursor to the nuclear exchange, and whose outcome shaped the political conditions under which the bombs fell. The simulation allows players to experience the famous battle that has been referenced throughout the series without ever being directly shown. The choice to frame this experience as a simulation rather than a direct flashback maintains the game's consistent perspective. We are always in the post-war world, accessing the pre-war world only through the records and reconstructions it left behind. The question of what happened between the original Fallout games and the Bethesda era is one that the series has handled through careful gaps rather than direct explanation. The period between Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 is more than 80 years of wasteland history that the games largely skip over. A century of post-apocalyptic development in which the new California Republic consolidated and expanded, the Enclave retreated and reorganized, the Brotherhood of Steel spread east, and the landscape of the wasteland was slowly and imperfectly transformed by human effort. This gap preserves the mystery of the interim while allowing each game to establish its own baseline conditions without having to account for everything that came before. The creations of the ghouls in Fallout's lore, beings who were human before the bombs and who survive long after with the evidence of radiation's effects visible in their bodies, raises questions that the series has explored in various ways across its installments. Ghouls can live for centuries, which means that some of the ghouls players encounter in later games were alive before the war and remember the world as it was. This creates a particular kind of character, the pre-war survivor who has watched the entire history of the wasteland unfold, who carries the memory of the old world as a lived experience rather than a historical record. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 is a ghoul who makes the particular tragedy of ghoul existence visible in a specific way. He is attempting to move his community into Tenpenny Tower, a luxury high-rise that survived the war and is now occupied by wealthy surface dwellers who bar ghouls from entering. The situation mirrors specific histories of exclusion and segregation in the real world closely enough to be unmistakable, and the game allows the player to resolve it in multiple ways, with different moral weights attached to each. The situation has no clean solution because the social dynamics it depicts have no clean solution in reality either. The design of Fallout's world consistently returns to the question of what survives. Physical objects survive the bombs better than institutions do. Pre-war canned food is still edible. Pre-war technology still functions. Pre-war music still plays on operational radio stations. But pre-war social contracts have largely dissolved, and pre-war political structures have been replaced by whatever could survive in the vacuum. This distinction between the material persistence of the old world and the social discontinuity that followed its end is one of the series' most quietly insistent themes, visible in the contrast between the intact artifacts scattered through the wasteland and the broken communities that scavenge through them. The vending machines of the Fallout world are one of the most persistent and quietly evocative details of the pre-war world that survived. They appear throughout the wasteland, still stocked with products, still operational in some cases, still promising satisfaction in the cheerful language of mid-century advertising. The Nuka-Cola machine, in particular, has become one of gaming's most recognizable environmental props, a piece of pop iconography that works because it contains within itself both the world that was and the world that remains, the promise of refreshment unchanged in a world that no longer resembles the one the machine was built for. The Slocum's Joe Donut Shop chain that appears in Fallout 4 as an environmental presence, its signage and storefronts scattered through the Commonwealth alongside other franchise remnants, is part of a broader effort in Fallout 4 to make pre-war Boston feel like a place that had an ordinary commercial life before the bombs. The mundane specificity of brand names and franchise locations gives the pre-war world a texture that makes its loss feel more concrete. We are not mourning an abstraction called civilization. We are mourning the specific thing, the coffee shop on the corner, the donut franchise down the street, the small daily comforts of an ordinary life. The Institute, the central antagonistic organization of Fallout 4, occupies a position in the game's moral landscape that is more complicated than simple villainy. Its scientists genuinely believe they are doing the right thing, that their research into synthetic humans represents the best hope for humanity's long-term survival, that the wasteland above is a lost cause whose suffering is irrelevant to the larger project. They are wrong, and the game makes this clear, but the game also takes their self-understanding seriously enough to present it as a coherent worldview rather than a mask for simple cruelty. The Institute is more frightening for having a genuine logic than it would be for simply doing harm for harm's sake. The Minutemen of Fallout 4, the faction the player can rebuild from near dissolution into a functioning protective force for Commonwealth settlements, represent a specific kind of hope in the game's world. Not the hope of a great centralized power reasserting order, but the hope of ordinary people protecting each other. Their visual language, muskets and tricorn hats, colonial militia aesthetics, connects them to the American founding mythology that Fallout 4's Boston setting makes particularly resonant. The Minutemen are attempting to rebuild the thing that was lost, not by restoring the pre war government, but by recovering its founding ideals in a form suited to the world as it actually is. The Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4 placed the player on a fog shrouded island off the main coast, exploring a conflict between human settlers, a community of synths seeking refuge, and a religious cult organized around the children of Adam, who worship the nuclear devastation as a form of divinity. The island's atmosphere was explicitly inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's Innsmouth stories. The fog, the isolation, the cult with its unsettling theology, the sense of a community built around something the outside world would find incomprehensible. The DLC represents one of the more successful uses of the Fallout framework to explore a specific genre register, applying the series' tools to horror with genuine effectiveness. The Children of Adam, who appear across multiple Fallout games in various forms, represent one of the series' most consistent religious ideas. The possibility that nuclear devastation could be understood as not destruction, but transformation. That the radiation which killed billions could be interpreted as a gift of the atom, a divine process of division and change. The theology is clearly born of traumatic adaptation, a community that has found a way to live with the thing that destroyed the world by treating it as sacred. The Fallout games treat this belief system with a kind of respectful neutrality, presenting it as internally coherent without endorsing or condemning it. The technical innovations that Fallout has made across its history include systems that have influenced game design more broadly. The conversation system developed for Fallout 3, in which dialogue options are presented as choices with visible consequences, influenced the design of numerous later RPGs. The Radiant Quest system, which generates an apparently infinite supply of procedural quests to maintain the sense of a living world, has appeared in various forms in many open-world games. The environmental storytelling approach, the use of object placement, skeletal arrangements, and terminal entries to tell stories without direct narration, has become one of the most widely imitated techniques in the medium. The loading screens of Fallout games have always contained small pieces of lore and historical detail that supplement the main game experience. Players waiting for an area to load are presented with tips, historical notes, and contextual information that fills in the world's background without requiring direct engagement. This approach treats the loading screen as a space for supplementary storytelling rather than simply a technical pause, and it has produced some of the series' most compact and effective pieces of lore delivery. The loading screen tip about Brahmin being unable to stand back up if tipped is as much a piece of wasteland knowledge as anything discovered through questing. The post-nuclear religion and philosophy that develops throughout the Fallout world reflects the full range of human responses to catastrophe. The Brotherhood of Steel, organized around the preservation and hoarding of technology, developed from a military unit whose commanding officer underwent what the game's lore describes as a crisis of conscience in the aftermath of the war. The New California Republic developed a political philosophy that deliberately referenced pre-war democracy while trying to avoid its worst failures. Caesar's Legion rejected the old world entirely and built something new from Roman historical models. Each of these responses to the same event is internally consistent, and the series has generally resisted the temptation to declare any of them simply right. The Fallout series' treatment of pre-war history consistently positions the nuclear exchange not as an accident or as the act of a single reckless individual, but as the outcome of a long sequence of decisions made by governments, corporations, and individuals, each of whom believed they were making reasonable choices. The biological weapons treaty violation that provoked China's strike did not come from nowhere. The surveillance state, the resource wars, the social stratification that made the Vault program possible, These were all products of the same civilization that is now ruins underfoot. The bombs are the conclusion of a story that was already being written before they fell. The slow, atmospheric pacing of the wasteland itself, the vast, empty spaces between locations, the quiet that lies over irradiated landscapes, the way the wind moves through ruined buildings, is one of the Fallout series' most underappreciated achievements. The game's reward stopping, looking around, taking in the specific quality of light in a post-nuclear sky, noticing the details in the environments that no quest requires you to notice. The wasteland is designed to be inhabited as much as it is designed to be traversed, and the players who move through it slowly tend to come away with a different relationship to it than those who move from objective to objective as efficiently as possible. The Fallout world is full of stories that complete themselves without the player's involvement, playing out in terminals and holotapes and environmental arrangements that document things that happened before the player arrived, and that will continue to mean what they mean regardless of whether any player ever reads them. A skeleton in a particular position beside a particular object tells a complete story. A series of holotape recordings traces an argument that culminated in something the physical environment then describes. The vault terminals trace a social history that needed no witnesses to have been real. These stories are among the most honest things about the Fallout world, the acknowledgement that the past happened whether or not anyone was paying attention. The landscape of the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3, and the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, and the Mojave in New Vegas, and the West Virginia of Fallout 76. Each of these settings has its own specific character, shaped by the particular history and geography of the real places they reference. The Capital Wasteland carries the weight of national symbolic space. The Commonwealth carries the particular melancholy of a region whose intellectual and revolutionary history has become rubble. The Mojave carries the dust and distance of the American Southwest, the landscape of frontier mythology applied to a post-frontier world. West Virginia carries the specific texture of Appalachian terrain and tradition, mountain forests, and abandoned industrial infrastructure, and the particular cultural memory of a region that was already disappearing before the bombs added their final word. The relationship between Fallout's world and the real world it diverged from is one of the series' most interesting, ongoing creative tensions. The games are not simply dystopian fantasies. They are built from real history, real politics, real corporate behavior, real institutional logic, pushed forward into an extreme that is recognizable precisely because its origins are familiar. The Vault-Tec experiments are recognizable because real institutions have conducted comparable experiments. The Enclave's claim to legitimate authority is recognizable because real governments have made similar claims. The cheerful advertising that covers the pre-war world is recognizable because it covers our world too. Fallout holds a mirror up to the present through the frame of a future that never happened. The wasteland survivors who have built communities from the wreckage of the old world, the farmers of small settlements, the traders who travel dangerous roads, the doctors and teachers and mechanics who maintain fragile infrastructure in difficult circumstances, are the human center of the Fallout world. The factions and the vaults and the legendary monsters get most of the attention, but it is these ordinary figures who make the world feel inhabited rather than simply designed. The unnamed settler who has maintained a functioning water purifier for 20 years, the scavenger who has mapped the dangerous territories between two towns, the teacher who runs a school in the ruins of a public library. These characters carry the world's future in quiet ways. The question of whether civilization can be rebuilt, and if so, into what form, is the question that every Fallout game asks, and none of them fully answers. The New California Republic represents one answer, a democratic government with all the compromises and corruptions that democracy involves in practice. Mr. House represents another, technocratic governance, by a single sufficiently capable individual, efficient and free of democratic friction, but entirely dependent on the quality and intentions of that individual. The Institute represents yet another scientific governance, the rule of the most knowledgeable over the least, with the assumption that knowledge produces benevolence that the game spends considerable effort questioning. The endings of Fallout New Vegas, which vary significantly based on the player's choices throughout the game, represent the series' most sustained meditation on this question. Different endings deliver different visions of the Mojave's future: an NCR victory that extends democratic governance, but also its bureaucratic mediocrity; a Legion victory that establishes order through brutality; an independent New Vegas under House's continued management; an independent New Vegas under the player's direction. None of these endings is presented as simply optimal, and the game's narrator delivers each of them in a tone that acknowledges both what was gained and what was lost in the choosing. The Fallout series has accumulated across its multiple games and their expansions one of the most fully realized fictional worlds in gaming, a world with continuous internal logic, extended historical depth, and the capacity to make room for new stories without losing coherence. The developers who have worked within it across different studios and different creative periods have disagreed about many things, produced different visions of what the world should be, and occasionally created continuity that requires careful management. But the world they have built together is one whose details reward investigation, whose margins contain stories worth finding, and whose central questions remain genuinely open. What kind of world do you want to build when the old one is gone? Who gets to decide? What do you owe to the people around you? And what do you owe to the future you cannot fully imagine? The Fallout games ask these questions in the context of rubble and radiation and the occasional two-headed cow, and somehow that context makes the questions more vivid rather than less. The distance of the post-apocalypse creates a clarity that the present resists. When everything has already been lost, the choices about what to rebuild become legible in a way they are not when the structures of the old world are still standing. Somewhere deep in the vaults, in the terminals that no one reads anymore, in the holotapes that play in the dark after everyone has gone, the old world is still speaking. Its cheerful advertisements that still promise refreshment and safety and the good life that awaits the well-prepared. Its scientists still explain the rationale for everything they did. Its overseers still record their observations in professional language that carefully avoids the human weight of what is being described. And the wasteland above continues, patient and enormous, accumulating the slow growth of something new from the materials of something ended. The vault doors have sealed and unsealed and sealed again. The radio stations play their long playlists of songs about love and longing from a world that ended before most of their listeners were born. The Brahmin wander through the ruins of shopping malls and the remnants of suburban streets, indifferent to the history underfoot. And somewhere in all of that, in the quiet spaces between the facts and the lore and the mechanics and the memories, is the thing that keeps people returning to this world, the sense that it is saying something true in a very loud and irradiated voice about the world we actually inhabit and the choices that are still being made in it. The sun that rises over the Capital Wasteland, over the Commonwealth, over the Mojave and the Appalachian Highlands, rises over ruins that were once the most powerful civilization in human history. It illuminates the remains of the ambition that built those things and the decisions that destroyed them. And in that light, in the specific quality of a post-nuclear dawn, the Fallout world offers something that few fictional universes manage. Not an escape from difficult truths, but a way of seeing them clearly from a distance sufficient to think about them without the noise of the immediate world getting in the way. The Fallout series has always found room for humor alongside its harder reflections, And this balance is part of what makes the world feel genuinely alive rather than relentlessly grim. The talking plants of Fallout 2, encountered in a specific corner of the game and never explained by any lore or developer statement, were included as a joke that simply never got removed. They remain in the game's world without justification, a small, absurdist anomaly in an otherwise cohesive setting, the kind of detail that reminds players that the world was made by human beings who sometimes found things funny, and that the wasteland has room for the inexplicable alongside the tragic. The Fallout series has always treated the question of intelligence with particular care. A high intelligence character navigates the world through explanation and persuasion, finding solutions to problems that a lower attribute character might need to solve through force. But the game never presents intelligence as simply superior. A low charisma genius can fail to convince a single settler of anything, while a high charisma character of middling intellect can lead armies through the force of personality alone. The special system distributes its advantages across human qualities that the real world distributes equally unevenly, which gives each character build its own authentic texture. The luck statistic in Fallout is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of the 7 special attributes. High luck affects critical hit chances, gambling outcomes, and various probability checks throughout the game world, a statistical modifier that represents something genuinely unmeasurable in the real world. The game treats luck as a real quantity that some people simply have more of than others, a view of fortune as unequally distributed gift rather than random variation. This produces some of the series' funniest and most gratifying moments, where improbable outcomes stack on each other in ways that feel less like chance and more like the universe briefly taking a personal interest. The radiation mechanic in Fallout operates as a persistent secondary health system, accumulating in the player's body through environmental exposure and certain foods and drinks, gradually reducing the maximum health available until addressed. This design creates a world where the environment itself is a constant threat, where the landscape's history of nuclear exchange is present in the air and water and food, as well as in the ruins and the mutated creatures. Managing radiation is managing the legacy of the war, treating the body as a site where history accumulates in physical form. Radaway, the fictional pharmaceutical that reduces accumulated radiation, is one of the most useful and most frequently used items in the Fallout series. Its existence as a product, manufactured before the war, distributed through vending machines and medical facilities, still found 200 years later in largely intact condition, implies a pre-war world where radiation exposure was common enough that a consumer-grade treatment for it had been developed and widely distributed. The cheerful packaging of Radaway, like the packaging of most pre-war products, communicates the world's specific combination of genuine technological achievement and deeply buried anxiety about that achievement. The super mutants of the West Coast, the ones visible in Fallout and Fallout 2, have a specific origin in the Master's Army, a project undertaken by the first game's primary antagonist to transform humanity into what he believed was a superior form. The Master's plan had a flaw that the player can expose through dialogue. The super mutants created by the process are sterile. An army of sterile beings cannot be the foundation of humanity's future, and when this contradiction is placed before the Master directly, in the right conversation with sufficient evidence, it can produce one of gaming's most memorable villainous responses, a genuine reconsideration that ends the threat without violence being required. The option to defeat the Master through persuasion rather than combat is one of the original Fallout's most celebrated design achievements. The game presents genuine evil, an intelligence that has caused enormous suffering in pursuit of its vision, and then creates space for that intelligence to hear an argument against itself and respond to it honestly. This is a vision of conflict resolution that many games have aspired to and few have achieved with comparable conviction. The Master is not simply a final boss, he is a character, and the game treats him as one until the end. The children of the cathedral, the Master's human followers who believed in his vision of mutant transformation as human evolution, represent one of Fallout's most interesting studies of ideological commitment. They are not simply deluded. They believe what they believe with genuine conviction, and their belief is built on a foundation of real observations about the failures of ordinary humanity. That their solution is wrong does not make their diagnosis entirely incorrect, which is precisely the uncomfortable quality that makes the original Fallout's confrontation with its antagonist so much more interesting than a simple conflict between good and evil. The Mariposa military base, where the West Coast supermutant transformation process was conducted using the forced evolutionary virus, appears in both the original Fallout and Fallout 2 in different states of ruin. By the time of Fallout 2, the base has been largely destroyed, but still radiates a sense of its former terrible purpose. The FEVA VATs that produced the supermutants were themselves a military project, research into biological enhancement that the war appropriated for its own ends, a familiar pattern in the Fallout world where scientific achievement and institutional purpose diverge in ways that produce catastrophe. The Shi, the descendants of a Chinese submarine crew that washed ashore in California after the nuclear exchange, represent one of Fallout 2's more quietly thoughtful pieces of world building. A community built from the survivors of the war's opposing side, living in a coastal city, developing their own culture and technology over 2 centuries of post-war existence. The Shir represent the possibilities of new community forming from the most unlikely seeds. Their presence in San Francisco complicates the simple national narratives that the Enclave tries to maintain, demonstrating that the human capacity for adaptation and community does not respect the political categories of the world that was destroyed. The ghoul city of Gecko in Fallout 2, located near Vault City, exists in a relationship of mutual dependency and mutual hostility with its neighbor. Gecko operates a nuclear power plant that Vault City needs for energy, while Vault City has medical resources that Gecko's irradiated population could benefit from. The conflict between these two communities, each in possession of something the other needs, each unable to move past their differences to arrange an equitable exchange, is one of the most grounded political situations in the series, a small-scale version of the resource conflicts that shaped the pre-war world and that continue to shape its aftermath. The followers of the Apocalypse, who appear in multiple Fallout games as a humanitarian organization dedicated to education, medicine, and the preservation of knowledge, represent one of the series' most consistently positive factions without being presented as naive. The followers operate in the wasteland on the understanding that people are better served by knowledge and healthcare than by ideology, and their neutrality in factional conflicts is a principled position rather than an absence of values. In Fallout New Vegas, where they are available as an ally faction, their end-state narration describes continued work in the Mojave, regardless of which major faction wins the game's main conflict, a quiet statement that humanitarian work continues independent of politics. The energy weapons of Fallout, the plasma rifles, laser pistols, and Gatling lasers that sit alongside the more conventional firearms in the game's armories, represent the pre-war world's investment in directed energy technology as a military application. The fact that pre-war energy weapons still function 2 centuries after they were manufactured is a piece of the same logic that keeps Nuka-Cola machines operational and pre-war food edible. The material products of the old world were built to last, a quality that the world's social and political structures entirely failed to share. The Tesla armor and other high-technology equipment found in various Fallout games, carries traces of the pre war scientific projects that produced it, projects conducted by a civilization that reached genuine technological achievement in specific areas, even as it failed to develop the wisdom to manage that achievement responsibly. The armor that reflects the most intense scientific investment of a civilization whose scientists also built the weapons that ended it is one of Fallout's more quietly eloquent pieces of environmental irony. The concept of the wasteland itself, the word and what it contains, has expanded across the series to mean something richer than simple devastation. A wasteland is a place where the ordinary categories of the old world no longer apply, where the social hierarchies and economic systems and political arrangements of before have dissolved. But the wasteland is also a place where new categories are being built, where the survivors of catastrophe are working out what they owe each other and what they are willing to do to survive. Every game in the series is simultaneously set in a place of destruction and a place of reconstruction, and the tension between those two things gives the world its particular energy. The Pip-Boy's map function, which charts the game world as the player explores it, mirrors the way the player themselves develops a mental map of the wasteland through experience. Locations begin as blank space and acquire detail as they are visited, the fog of war lifting to reveal the specific shape of the world the player has moved through. This mechanic, common to many open-world games, has a particular resonance in Fallout, where the unknown territory between known locations is genuinely dangerous, and where the act of filling in the map carries something of the explorer's particular satisfaction. The Fallout world's relationship to memory is one of its most consistently interesting thematic concerns. The world is full of the memory objects of the old civilization: intact buildings, working technology, preserved broadcasts, that saved recordings. But the human memory of the world before the bombs is fragmentary and unreliable, passed down through oral tradition and the distorting filter of 2 centuries of hardship. The gap between the material persistence of the old world and the fading human memory of what it meant is one of the places where the series does its most quietly moving work. The ghoul Raul Tejada, companion in Fallout New Vegas, carries the weight of specific personal history from before the war. He was a Mexican gunslinger whose family died in the nuclear exchange and who has spent the 2 centuries since living through the entire history of the wasteland. His optional personal quest, which asks the player to help him decide whether to return to his old life or embrace a new one, is one of the more thoughtful pieces of character writing in the series. The question it asks, whether a person defined by their past can choose a different future, is one that resonates beyond the fictional frame. The ending slides of the Fallout games, the narrated sequences that describe the outcomes of the player's choices for the various factions and communities of the game world, represent one of the series' most effective storytelling techniques. The slides show the consequences of actions that the player made hours or days earlier in their playthrough, connecting the small decisions of moment-to-moment play to long-term outcomes that the player did not witness directly. The consequences arrive as narrated description over still images in the style of old film serials, which gives them a documentary quality that the game's interactive sections cannot quite achieve. These endings communicate something important about the Fallout world's relationship to consequence: that actions matter, that the world responds to what is done within it, and that the player's presence in the wasteland leaves marks that persist after the credits roll. This is the implicit promise of every open-world game, but Fallout's ending slides make it explicit, showing specifically what changed because of what was done, and asking the player to sit with that record for a moment before the game lets them go. The wasteland is quiet now. The radio has faded to static somewhere in the distance, and the last of the evening's exploration has concluded in a long, slow drift through the details and the depth of the world. The power armor stands in its frame by the door, the Pip-Boy's screen is dark, and whatever the morning brings for the wasteland's survivors, tonight belongs to rest. The vault door holds. The stars are visible through a crack in the ceiling, the same stars they always were, persistent above 200 years of human struggle, unchanged and patient, waiting for whatever comes next. The world of Fallout has accumulated, across all its games and all their quiet corners, something that few fictional universes achieve: the sense of a place that was real before the player arrived and that continues to be real after they leave. The terminals keep their records, the holotapes preserve their voices. The environmental arrangements of bones and scattered possessions tell the stories of people who will never be named in any dialogue or quest. And the survivors who wander through it all, the traders and farmers and scavengers and idealists and mercenaries, continue their imperfect, determined work of building something from the remains of something else. There is a specific kind of companionship available in the Fallout world that no other setting quite replicates: the companionship of shared knowledge, of moving through a world whose history you are gradually learning, of finding one more terminal entry that explains one more piece of what happened. The world gives back in proportion to what you bring to it, rewarding attention and curiosity with the particular satisfaction of a picture that resolves slowly into clarity from its component details. Tonight, some of those details have arrived here, settling into the background of wherever you are, becoming part of the quiet knowledge that the night holds. The bombs fell a long time ago in the Fallout world. The vault doors opened, the wasteland was crossed, civilizations rose and fell again, and began to rise once more from the new ruins. And through all of it, the ink spots play somewhere on a crackling frequency, singing about not wanting to set the world on fire, a love song persisting in the aftermath of the thing its title describes. There is something in that image, the music continuing, the sentiment intact, the voice unchanged above the changed world, that is as good a summary of the Fallout universe as any longer description can provide. The human things persist. The love and the music and the stubborn insistence on building something persist, even here, even now, even in the quiet that follows everything. These are the details and the depths of this extraordinary world, the facts and the lore and the small moments that accumulate into something larger than any individual piece of them. They have arrived tonight like the radio signal from a distant station, finding you wherever you are, in whatever quiet place you have made for yourself as the world outside grows still. Let them settle now, along with everything else the night has brought, as the vault doors close gently on another long exploration and the wasteland returns to its patient silence. The pre-war money scattered throughout every Fallout game, those paper bills printed with the faces of the old Republic, found in cash registers and wallets and old briefcases still locked under ruined desks, carries a particular kind of melancholy that is easy to walk past without fully registering. The bills are worth nothing in the wasteland economy, having long since been replaced by Nuka-Cola bottle caps as the primary medium of exchange. But they still exist, still hold their physical form, still display their denominations in the clean typeset of the old world's printing offices. They are one of the purest pieces of evidence that the world ended very suddenly, that someone was holding money when the bombs fell, and that the money outlasted everything the money was ever supposed to buy. The bottle cap economy of the Fallout world is itself one of the more carefully considered pieces of world building in the series. Caps became currency not through any central decree, but through a combination of factors. They are durable, difficult to counterfeit, produced in consistent quantities before the war, and their adoption was driven initially by the Hub, the major trading center of the West Coast, whose merchants standardized them as a medium of exchange. This organic development of post-war currency, arising from practical necessity rather than institutional design, reflects the broader pattern of the wasteland, civilization reassembling itself from whatever materials are available, finding functions for pre war objects that were never intended for them. The hub itself, the great trade city of the West Coast, visible in the original Fallout, is one of the locations that gives the series its specific sense of economic depth. It is not simply a town that survived the war, it is a place that built something new from the wreckage, a commercial center whose existence implies supply chains and trade routes and relationships between communities stretching across hundreds of miles of irradiated desert. The hub's merchants, caravans, and trading companies are evidence that the economic instinct, the human drive to exchange goods and build systems for doing so, survived the collapse of civilization, even when so much else did not. The caravans that move between settlements in the Fallout world represent a specific kind of courage that the games rarely make explicit. The roads of the wasteland are dangerous in ways that the relative safety of towns and vaults makes easy to forget. Raider camps, mutant predators, radiation zones, the unpredictability of weather and terrain in a post-nuclear landscape. The people who chose to become caravan traders, to accept the constant risk of the open road in exchange for the economic opportunities of moving goods between communities, are among the wasteland's unsung builders. Their roots are the arteries of whatever commerce exists, and their willingness to travel them is what makes isolated settlements less isolated. The Sunset Sarsaparilla brand, which plays a central role in Fallout New Vegas's Mojave Wasteland, represents a specific pre-war corporate identity that the game develops with unusual depth. The star cap mystery, the discovery that certain caps were marked with stars and could be redeemed for a legendary prize, creates a quest that spans the entire game world and connects the present-day search for caps to the pre-war marketing campaign that distributed them. The treasure at the end of the quest, like many of Fallout's promised rewards, turns out to be more complicated than the legend suggests, carrying with it a history that transforms the cheerful collectible hunt into something considerably darker. The Nuka World DLC expansion for Fallout 4 places the player inside the ruins of a pre-war theme park built around the Nuka-Cola brand, and the experience of moving through that space, through the Galactic Zone, through the Safari section, through the candy-colored ruins of attractions designed for families who no longer exist, is one of the series' most effective meditations on what advertising optimism looks like in the aftermath of catastrophe. The park was built to make people feel good, to associate the Nuka-Cola brand with joy and family and the future. The ruins of that project are as eloquent as any political ruin in the series, though the language they speak is the language of commercialism rather than governance. Inside Nuka World's Galactic Zone, the display cases hold toy rockets labeled with names of fictional space corporations that appear nowhere else in the game's world, invented companies whose entire existence was to populate a theme park attraction for a few seconds of a visitor's attention. The terminal beside them references corporate mergers that make no internal sense, including the acquisition of a shoe company by a robotics manufacturer. These details were added purely as environmental texture, jokes between developers who were building an attraction rather than lore. And yet they work in precisely the way that all of Fallout's best details work. They make the place feel like it was actually there, occupied by actual people who had actual corporate anxieties before everything ended. A vent inside the same building hums at a frequency that matches the opening notes of the Nuka-Cola jingle. This is not a detail that most players will ever notice, because noticing it requires standing beside the vent for longer than any quest or objective will hold a player in that spot. It is a detail for the person who has already finished everything else and is simply moving through the space, listening to the ambient sounds of a ruined park. That it exists at all, that someone put it there knowing that almost no one would ever hear it, is characteristic of Fallout's relationship to its own world. The detail does not exist for the player. It exists because the world exists, and the world is thorough. The Protectron robots that appear throughout the Fallout series carry more unused voice lines than almost any other non-human character type. Buried in the files of Fallout New Vegas are recordings of a Protectron variant who believes himself to be a lounge singer. His lines, including the announcement of a smooth jazz protocol and the offer to perform his full repertoire if the player will simply remain still for a moment. This variant never appears in the game. The recordings were made, filed, and left in the game's data as a trace of an idea that was developed far enough to require voice acting before being set aside. The existence of those recordings is a kind of ghost, the evidence of something that was almost real and then was not. The bloatfly, one of the series' oldest enemy types, has wings that beat at a speed inconsistent with the physical scale of the creature. This was a deliberate choice by the animation team for Fallout 3, who wanted the creature to look wrong in a specific way, too fast, too frantic, moving at a pace that made it seem like something was deeply incorrect about its relationship to the laws governing flight. The effect was carried forward into every subsequent game, meaning that every bloatfly in the series shares the same wrongness, the same violation of what flight should look like. It is a small thing, but it contributes to the creature's distinct unpleasantness in a way that technically accurate wing physics would not. The Deathclaw's roar in Fallout 4 was constructed from recordings of a lion and an alligator layered together and slowed significantly, producing a sound that has no real-world equivalent, but that every player who has heard it will recognize immediately. The creature that produces this sound can, according to behavior patterns that players discovered through experimentation, be distracted by the placement of a teddy bear on the ground near it. The exact mechanism behind this behavior was never officially explained, and it may be a quirk of the creature's AI target priority rather than an intentional design choice. But it transforms one of the most dangerous enemies in the game into something briefly comprehensible, a creature with preferences, even if those preferences are inexplicable. The mannequins placed throughout abandoned buildings in the Fallout games occupy an unusual position in the game's visual vocabulary. Some are clearly positioned to tell specific stories, standing in groups, posed in relation to objects and spaces in ways that suggest an event occurred. Others are simply present, their poses the result of hand placement without particular narrative intention, and sometimes physics glitches that rotated them after the fact. The most famous of these unintentional arrangements is a mannequin in Fallout 4 that appears to be pointing toward a locked safe. Thousands of players investigated, certain that the gesture was a developer communication. The safe contained a single pre-war dollar. The mannequin was pointing at nothing. The myth persisted anyway, because Fallout has trained its players to believe that everything is pointing at something. The Silent Storm weather event in Fallout 76 is a glitch in the game's audio engine that occasionally causes rain to fall without any accompanying sound, and lightning to flash without thunder, and the entire ambient soundscape to simply cease. The world continues to function visually. Weather patterns, NPC behavior, environmental animations, but the sound that should accompany all of it is absent. Players who have encountered this event describe it as one of the most peaceful experiences in the game, a brief interval of absolute quiet in a world that is usually full of noise. The accident is, for some players, more beautiful than anything the game produced intentionally. The clocks of Fallout 4 stopped at 9:47 in the morning on the day the bombs fell, a detail encoded into almost every clock model in the game's world, a frozen timestamp marking the moment the old world ended. A handful of clocks in Diamond City continue to tick, their animation active because a developer working on a pre-war interior cell forgot to disable it before the asset was repurposed. This oversight allows players who notice it to believe, briefly, that somewhere time never stopped, that in one corner of the wasteland, the seconds are still being counted as if they mattered. The real explanation is mundane. The effect is not. The pre-war newspapers scattered throughout Boston in Fallout 4 each display a different headline, but only the first few lines of any given paper are actually readable. The rest is lorem ipsum, the placeholder text used by designers working on layouts before actual content is written, the generic Latin phrases that fill space without meaning anything. These papers appear in every street, every home, every ruined office, the physical record of the old world's information infrastructure, now filled with words that say nothing at all. Whether this was a shortcut or an intentional comment on the meaninglessness of mass media in the face of catastrophe is a question the game does not answer, which means players have answered it themselves in the ways that Fallout always invites. The fancy lad snack cakes consumed throughout the wasteland list a calorie count of 0 on their packaging, a detail that achieves a very specific kind of humor. A preserved pastry from 2 centuries ago, still edible in a world transformed by nuclear fire, advertising itself as containing 0 calories. The Sugar Bomb cereal boxes describe their product as part of a balanced apocalypse, a phrase that requires exactly the right amount of awareness of pre-war advertising language to land as intended. The Salisbury steak can's ingredient list degrades across the series from a claim of actual beef content through progressively more honest admissions until Fallout 76's version simply says edible material, an honesty born of the accumulated weight of post-war pragmatism. The Abrow cleaner boxes that appear as environmental prop throughout the series carry slightly different design elements in each game, small variations that resulted from model redesigns rather than narrative intention. In Fallout New Vegas, the box includes the slogan "Kills germs you never knew existed," which achieves a remarkable irony in a world whose air and water and food are laced with radiation and mutagens that make pre-war germ concerns seem quaint. The slogan was not written as commentary. It is simply a piece of pre-war advertising language, preserved in an environment that makes it commentary, whether it wanted to be or not. The cram cans, a staple of the wasteland's food supply, exist in 2 distinct varieties for collectors attentive enough to notice. Versions placed before a particular patch, which have a specific weight value, and versions placed after, which weigh slightly differently. These cans are functionally identical. The difference between them serves no gameplay purpose, and yet the Fallout community developed the distinction into a collector's category, a way of tracking the game's version history through the physical properties of a fictional canned good. This is perhaps the most concentrated example of how Fallout's players engage with the game's world, finding significance in minutiae, building meaning from what is technically meaningless, because the world feels real enough to reward that kind of attention. The mole rats of Fallout 4 occasionally spawn underground near campfire locations and never emerge. They remain beneath the surface, but technically present in the game's encounter system, causing the player to register as being in combat even when nothing is visible on screen. The invisible conflict persists until the player moves far enough away to reset the encounter. This is a bug, not a design choice, but it creates a very specific experience, the sense of being in danger from something you cannot see, something working below the surface, threatening in its invisibility. It mirrors, entirely by accident, one of the actual themes of the Fallout world, the presence of danger that is not visible until it is too late. The Brahmin of Fallout 76, the 2-headed cattle who wander through Appalachia as they wander through every wasteland, share a navigation quirk inherited from earlier Bethesda engine builds, When idle, they face north. The developers became aware of this behavior, acknowledged it, and chose not to fix it, offering the explanation that the cows simply liked the north. This decision transformed what was a technical artifact into a piece of world building, a characteristic of the in-universe creatures that now exists as canon regardless of its technical origin. The Brahmin face north. This is true about the world of Fallout. It became true because the game's creators were willing to find the humor in a navigation bug. The sound design of Fallout 4 embedded a number of small, auditory jokes and references throughout its environments. The beeping of a mine in the moments before detonation spells the word boom in Morse code, a detail confirmed by the game's sound engineers, who included it as a kind of private acknowledgement that players would never notice. The vault door opening sequence for Vault 111 plays a low-frequency hum whose pitch sequence subtly encodes the vault's number. These are entirely unnoticeable during normal play, belonging to that category of detail that exists not to be found but to be made, to fill the game with the evidence of care, whether or not that care is ever recognized. The laser pistol sound in Fallout 4 is a composition of 3 entirely unrelated recordings: the discharge of a camera flash capacitor, the pluck of a guitar string, and the snap of a soda can tab opening. The combination produces something that sounds like nothing that exists in reality, which is precisely correct for a weapon that does not exist in reality. Sound engineers working on the game described the process as experimental, an attempt to find something memorable rather than accurate. The result is one of the most recognizable sounds in the series, a piece of invented sonic vocabulary that every Fallout 4 player carries as audio memory, without necessarily knowing where it comes from or how it was made. The terminals scattered throughout the Fallout games carry text that was not always written with fresh intent for each location. Files from earlier games were sometimes reused in later entries without modification, creating situations where computers in the Commonwealth reference locations and institutions from the West Coast wasteland of the original games, thousands of miles away, hundreds of years of game time distant. A terminal in Fallout 4 references the Boneyard, the Los Angeles ruin central to the first game's geography. The reference makes no narrative sense. The developers left it in place, and fans chose to treat it as evidence of a connected world rather than a recycled asset. The accident became continuity. The Protectrons, Mr. Handys, and Assaultrons that populate the Fallout world were all built before the bombs fell, designed for specific civilian and military applications that the post-war world has either repurposed or rendered entirely obsolete. A Mr. Handy unit designed to manage a household in the 1950s finds itself, 2 centuries later, still attempting to perform its household management functions in a house whose family has been gone for most of that time. The loyalty of these machines, their persistence in tasks whose original context has entirely dissolved, is one of the series' quietest emotional notes, the automation of devotion in circumstances that make devotion absurd. The Mr. Handy units in particular have voices and personalities that make their situations more poignant than the situation of a simple machine would be. They speak with warmth and gentle formality, with a cheerful insistence on service that reads differently when the family they serve is long dead. Codsworth, the sole survivor's pre-war Mr. Handy in Fallout 4, has spent 210 years maintaining a house that no one lives in, tending a lawn in a neighborhood reduced to rubble, waiting with mechanical patience for a family that was frozen in a vault without his knowledge. His cheerfulness in reunion carries within it the entire weight of those 2 centuries, compressed into the form of a floating robot with a British accent and a profound relief at having someone to serve again. The companion quest for Codsworth, available if the player chooses to bring him along rather than leaving him at the ruined house, allows a gentle exploration of what 210 years of solitary maintenance does to a machine designed for companionship. The quest does not provide a dramatic answer because Codsworth himself does not have a dramatic answer. He kept going because stopping was not in his programming, and the programming was all that remained when everything else was taken away. This is not presented as tragedy or triumph, but simply as fact, which is one of the more honest things Fallout 4 does with its character writing. The question of what the robots of the Fallout world remember and what they make of those memories is one the series returns to in various forms. The robo-brains, robot frames integrated with human brain tissue, occupy an even stranger position in this question. Being neither purely mechanical nor purely biological, their original human consciousness, presumably reduced or transformed by the integration process into something that thinks in its new form without being able to fully access what it was before. The robo-brains of the Institute in Fallout 4 were once people who donated their bodies to science in the pre-war era, a donation whose implications they almost certainly did not fully understand. The Institute itself, that underground scientific community beneath the Commonwealth that forms Fallout 4's central mystery, is a fascinating case study in what happens when scientific culture becomes entirely self-referential, when the external world is not consulted and not considered relevant to the work being done. The scientists of the Institute have been underground for so long, working on problems defined entirely by the Institute's own priorities and value system, that they have lost the ability to understand why anyone outside would object to what they do. They are not villains in their own understanding. They are scientists who have forgotten that their subjects are people. The SRB, the Institute's Synth Retention Bureau, the division responsible for tracking and retrieving escaped synths, represents the specific institutional face of this self-referentiality. Its agents move through the Commonwealth, unmemorable, doing the work of recovery and elimination as a matter of procedure. They are not distinguished by cruelty or enthusiasm. They are distinguished by the matter-of-factness with which they perform their function, the administrative normalcy that makes what they do so unsettling. Fallout 4 uses the SRB's operatives to show how institutional evil works in practice, not through spectacle but through procedure, not through exceptional individuals, but through ordinary ones doing their jobs. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to liberating synths and giving them new lives and new identities, operates from a location whose significance is historical as well as narrative. The organization's headquarters beneath the old North Church, in the tunnels below one of the buildings most associated with the American Revolution's underground networks, places the liberation of synthetic beings in specific relationship to earlier histories of resistance and escape. The Fallout world does not make this connection explicit, but it is impossible to miss for a player who knows anything about the building they are standing in. The symbolism is earned rather than announced. The old North Church of colonial Boston was the site of the signal lanterns that warned Paul Revere of the British Army's movements to, if by sea, a moment of underground communication that helped launch the American Revolution. The railroad's choice of this building as its base has a particular resonance in a game about a revolution over the rights of synthetic people, about underground networks carrying individuals to freedom, about signals and codes and the infrastructure of clandestine organization. The building's history does not appear in any game dialogue. It is simply part of what the building is, and part of what the game means by choosing it. The Freedom Trail, the actual walking trail through Boston that connects landmarks from American history, appears in Fallout 4 as a puzzle whose solution draws on knowledge of the trail's real-world history. Following the red line through the ruined city, reading the letters at each landmark to decode the railroad's hidden location, creates an experience that makes the ruins of the city feel simultaneously like a game environment and like a real place with real history. For players who know Boston, the trail is haunted by the gap between what the city was and what the game has made of it. For players who do not know Boston, the trail still works as a puzzle, but carries less of its full weight. The Brotherhood of Steel's presence in the Capital Wasteland of Fallout 3, arriving by airship after crossing a country, marks one of the more dramatically effective entrances in the series. The Pridwin, the massive airship that serves as the Brotherhood's mobile base in Fallout 4, represents an engineering achievement that the game uses as a visual statement about the faction's resources and ambitions. Seeing it for the first time, appearing over the ruins of Boston from a distance, is one of Fallout 4's most carefully designed spectacle moments. It is a reminder that the Brotherhood of Steel is not a militia or a scavenging band. It is a military organization with genuine industrial capacity, and that capacity is both impressive and threatening depending on one's perspective. Elder Maxon, the leader of the Brotherhood in Fallout 4, is described in the game's lore as having risen to leadership at an exceptionally young age after a series of traumatic events and conflicts within the organization. His characterization as a young leader who has internalized a very specific and inflexible ideology is one of the game's more interesting political portraits, a figure whose genuine competence and commitment are inseparable from an absolutism that makes him dangerous. The Brotherhood under Maxon is more powerful and more organized than it has been in previous games, and the game makes clear that this increase in power corresponds to an increase in the faction's willingness to act on its most extreme positions. Fallout 4's main story rests on a deliberate structural choice. All four of the game's joinable factions are presented as having genuine motivations and genuine flaws, and choosing any of them requires accepting their limitations alongside their strengths. The Minutemen are idealistic, but have almost no resources. The Railroad is morally clear on the synth question, but narrowly focused. The Brotherhood has resources and organization, but its ideology is exclusionary, and its methods are harsh. The Institute has the most advanced technology on the East Coast and believes it is humanity's best hope, but its relationship to the wasteland it inhabits is one of exploitation rather than engagement. Each faction offers a different answer to the same question about how to rebuild, and the game does not pretend any answer is without cost. The creation of the Courser program, the Institute's elite synthetic operatives, distinguishable from ordinary synths by their independence and their capacity for improvisation, represents a specific design decision that has interesting implications for the game's central philosophical question. Coursers are synths designed to hunt synths, to bring back escaped members of their own kind to an institution that treats them as property. The game does not pause to examine how a synthetic being experiences the task of enforcing the system of its own oppression, but it presents the existence of the program clearly enough for players to consider the question themselves. The sole survivor's backstory, a resident of the Boston suburbs who was frozen in Vault 111 with their family on the day of the Great War, and who emerges 2 centuries later to find their spouse dead and their child missing, is the most explicitly personal opening premise in the series. Previous protagonists were defined by their circumstances without being given pre-established lives. The sole survivor enters the wasteland with specific losses already incurred, a specific mission already established, and a specific emotional weight that the game carries with varying degrees of effectiveness. The choice to give the protagonist a life before the game begins is the most significant character design decision in Fallout 4's development, and its implications shape every faction choice and every relationship in the game. The Memory Den in Fallout 4, a location in the settlement of Goodneighbor, where a woman named Irma manages a device that allows customers to relive recorded memories, is one of the game's most quietly poetic locations. The device's use in the main quest, which allows the player to experience a memory belonging to the mercenary Kellogg, is a practical plot mechanism. But the existence of the business itself, the idea that people in the post war world pay for the chance to relive specific memories, to exist for an hour in a curated past, says something about loss and longing and the human relationship to the memories of a world that no longer exists. The business is Good Neighbor's most melancholy enterprise. Good Neighbor itself, the settlement of outcasts and operators that occupies the ruins of a portion of old Boston, represents a specific kind of community that the Fallout games return to in various forms. The place where people who cannot fit into more orderly societies find each other and build something together. Its mayor, the ghoul John Hancock, is named after and costumed in reference to one of the founding figures of American independence, a choice that carries both humor and genuine thematic weight. Hancock governs Good Neighbor through a combination of personal charisma and a genuine commitment to the community he has built, which makes him one of Fallout 4's more interesting political figures, a leader whose methods are unconventional, but whose loyalty to his people is real. The town of Megaton in Fallout 3, built around an unexploded nuclear bomb at its center, is one of the series' most effectively realized small communities. Its residents have built their lives around the bomb in ways that range from pragmatic to devotional, with the Children of Adam faction treating the unexploded warhead as a sacred object whose detonation would be an act of divine completion. The tension between the practical need to defuse the bomb and the community's complex emotional relationship to it gives the player one of the game's first meaningful choices: whether to honor the bomb's sacred status, to neutralize it quietly, or to allow its detonation in exchange for the resources that the game's main antagonist offers for doing so. The choice to destroy Megaton is one of the most discussed decisions in Fallout 3's moral landscape, not because it is narratively complex, but because it is so immediate and concrete. The town's residents are not abstractions. They have been introduced by name, their personalities sketched in brief conversations before the choice is presented. Choosing to detonate the bomb is choosing to kill specific people whose names and faces the player has registered for a reward that the game makes sufficiently substantial to function as a genuine temptation rather than simply a test of the player's moral clarity. The Fallout games have always understood that moral choices are most effective when the temptation is real. Rivet City, the aircraft carrier turned settlement that appears in Fallout 3 as one of the Capital Wasteland's most impressive and complex communities, represents the improvised infrastructure of the post-war world at its most ambitious. The residents of Rivet City have converted a naval vessel of the old world into a functioning city, complete with its own internal politics, its own economy, its own history of founding and faction and conflict. The ship's different sections house different communities and different institutions: a marketplace, a science lab, residential decks, a bar, all within the same steel hull. Rivet City is evidence of what human ingenuity can do with pre-war materials when it has enough time and enough people committed to the same project. The history of Rivet City, accessible through terminal records and NPC conversations, includes a schism in the settlement's early days that divided it into two factions occupying different parts of the ship. The conflict and its resolution are part of the living memory of the community's older residents, a founding mythology that the settlement has constructed around its origins. This is how civilizations work. They build stories about their origins that are partly true and partly shaped by the needs of the present. And the inclusion of this process in Fallout 3's world building gives Rivet City a specific sense of depth that more conventionally designed settlements lack. What have seemed impossible to their pre-war colleagues is one of Fallout 3's most quietly optimistic images. These scientists, working without the resources of the old world, without its infrastructure, without the institutional support that pre-war research depended on, are continuing the project of human knowledge anyway. They are doing science because science is what they do and who they are, in a world that makes very little space for either quality. Their presence suggests that the human capacity for inquiry persists, even when the conditions for it have been largely destroyed. The University of the Capital Wasteland, which exists only in fragments and references in Fallout 3, an institution that presumably existed before the bombs and whose legacy appears in the ruins of educational infrastructure across the region, represents the specific loss of institutional knowledge that nuclear war inflicted on the world. The loss of universities is not the most visible devastation in the Fallout landscape. It does not have the dramatic quality of ruined cities or the ongoing urgency of radiation and mutant threats. But the loss of the places where knowledge was systematically preserved and transmitted across generations is one of the deeper wounds the world carries, one whose effects compound over the 2 centuries that the games are set in. The School of Fallout 4, the various pre-war educational buildings that appear throughout the Commonwealth, including the elementary school that serves as the entrance to Vault 75, are among the game's most consistently moving environmental spaces. The evidence of what was being taught before the bombs fell, the artifacts of children's learning preserved in classrooms where no children have sat for 200 years, creates a specific kind of longing. The crayons and the small desks and the educational posters on the walls are an inventory of an ordinary life that the apocalypse ended on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and Fallout 4 uses that ordinariness as its most effective emotional tool. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Starcap mystery in Fallout New Vegas constructs an entire secondary economy around the question of what a pre-war marketing campaign was actually offering as its grand prize. The player collects star-marked caps throughout the Mojave, brings them to the redemption machine that the promotion's advertising described, and discovers that the prize is already spoken for, that someone arrived before them and claimed what was promised, and that the promise itself contained a darkness the advertising did not mention. The resolution of the Starcap quest is one of New Vegas's more effective small comedies, a meditation on what promised rewards look like when the company that made the promise has been gone for 200 years. The reputation system of Fallout New Vegas tracks the player's standing with each major faction independently, creating a political landscape in which improving your standing with one group can damage your relationship with another. Moving from anonymous stranger to accepted associate to celebrity to idolized legend within a faction changes how that faction's members address and respond to the player in ways that are subtle enough to feel organic. The inverse, the slide from suspicious outsider to enemy to villain to most wanted, creates experiences of escalating hostility that the game maps across its world in believable ways. No other Fallout game has managed the faction reputation system with the same granularity. The New Vegas Strip itself, the surviving heart of the pre-war casino culture of Las Vegas, maintained and operated under Mr. House's management as a beacon of civilization in the Mojave, is one of the series' most effective environmental contrasts. The lights and the music and the relative order of the strip exist within sight of the wasteland that surrounds it, a visible demonstration of what is possible when one entity with sufficient resources and sufficient determination decides to maintain something. The Strip is not a healthy society. It is a managed space designed to extract wealth from visitors, but it is a functioning space, and in the context of the Mojave, functioning is a significant achievement. The casinos of the Strip are individually designed spaces with their own aesthetics, their own histories, and their own games of chance, whose odds and mechanics reflect the pre-war gambling culture that produced them. The Ultra Luxe, with its white-jacketed clientele and its carefully maintained atmosphere of old-world elegance, conceals a secret that the game eventually reveals to players who investigate it. The Gomorrah manages its own economy of vice, with an organization structure that goes deeper than the games and rooms, visible to casual visitors. Even the Lucky 38, Mr. House's own casino that is closed to the public and serves as his personal residence and operational center has a design philosophy that reflects his specific aesthetic sensibilities and his specific vision of what civilization should look like. The three families who operate the Strip's casinos under Mr. House's arrangement, the White Glove Society, the Chairman, and the Omertas, each represent a different post-war cultural adaptation, a different way of using the Strip's resources and history to construct an identity. The White Gloves built an identity around pre-war aristocratic culture, the Chairman around the entertainment and showmanship traditions associated with Las Vegas entertainment, and the Omertas around the organized crime traditions that were always part of the gambling industry's history. Each of these identities is partially constructed, partially remembered, partially invented to fill the gap left by the loss of the actual culture they reference. They are performing versions of things they know only from records and artifacts. The Yes Man questline in Fallout New Vegas, the option to take control of New Vegas for the player character directly, supported by a reprogrammed Securitron who is incapable of refusing any instruction, is the game's wildest and most philosophically interesting conclusion option. Taking the Mojave for yourself, cutting out both the NCR and Caesar's Legion, refusing Mr. House's vision while also refusing to simply hand power to an established institution, produces an ending that the game's narrator delivers with a specific kind of uncertainty. No one knows what the player character will do with the power they have taken. The game presents this as neither triumph nor tragedy, but simply as the beginning of another story, whose ending is not yet written. The ending narrations of Fallout New Vegas are among the finest pieces of writing in the series, delivered by the veteran actor who voices the game's narrator in a tone that holds grief and recognition and the specific weight of consequence in equal balance. Each faction's narration describes what happened to that community in the years following the events of the game, the long echoes of what was done. Some of these outcomes are clearly good, some are clearly bad. Many are complicated, containing genuine improvement in some areas and genuine harm in others, refusing to resolve into the clean moral accounting that simpler games would provide. They are the work of writers who respected the player enough to give them real consequences rather than reassuring ones. The Wild Wasteland trait in Fallout New Vegas, which could be selected during character creation, added additional absurdist and humorous encounters to the game world, strange events that appeared only if the character had taken on this particular aspect of personality. It was the game's formal acknowledgement that the Fallout world contains two registers simultaneously, the serious and the farcical, and that some players might prefer to have that farcical element turned up. The encounters added by the trait include references to other games, films, and cultural moments tucked into the game world as private jokes between the developers and the players attentive enough to notice them. Fallout's relationship to humor has always been more considered than it might appear. The games are not comedies, but they are not free of comedy either. They contain it as a component, as one of the registers through which the world expresses itself. The humor of the Fallout world is characteristically dark, rooted in the gap between pre-war optimism and post-war reality, between what was promised and what exists. But it is also sometimes simply silly, and the games have generally been willing to be silly in ways that do not undermine their serious purposes. The Two-Headed Cow is not a tragedy. The Gary clones are both horrifying and very funny. The talking plants of Fallout 2 were never explained. The game is large enough to hold all of these things at once. The Fallout universe's version of history, the divergence from our own timeline, the extended atomic age, the resource wars, the Great War, is built with enough internal consistency that players can trace cause and effect through it in ways that feel genuinely historical rather than simply backstory. The resource wars that preceded the nuclear exchange were fought over oil and other depleted natural resources, and the political alliances and enmities of that conflict shaped the specific targets and timing of the nuclear exchange itself. China and America were not simply two nations that happened to destroy each other. They were the final expression of a decades long competition that had been consuming the world's resources and the world's political stability in roughly equal measure. The Enclave's belief that the nuclear exchange, horrible as it was, represented an opportunity, a chance to rebuild from a position of total control without the compromises of the old world's democratic and commercial messiness, is one of the series' clearest examples of ideology as pathology. The Enclave had the resources and the institutional knowledge to provide genuine leadership in the post-war world. It chose instead to spend those resources on a project of domination, a plan for a new America whose population would be selected from among the few who met criteria that the Enclave itself had defined. The plan in Fallout 2, involving an airborne FEV delivery system that would have killed almost everything still living on the West Coast, represents the logical endpoint of this ideology, a civilization whose purity was purchased at the cost of everything else. The Enclave's defeat in Fallout 2 and its subsequent reappearance in a different form in Fallout 3, and its continuing afterlife in the form of cells and remnants scattered through the series after that, represents one of Fallout's most interesting ongoing threads: the persistence of institutional ideology even after the institution has been destroyed. The Enclave as an organization was defeated. The Enclave as a set of beliefs, as a visions of what America should be and who should be permitted to be part of it, proved considerably more durable. Its remnants appear in the wasteland, carrying their ideology forward, not because the organization survives, but because the beliefs survived in the minds of the people who held them. Dr. Henry, the scientist who appears in Fallout 2 and later in Fallout New Vegas, represents a continuity of character across the series that is rare and valuable, a specific person whose choices and consequences can be traced across games, whose history adds weight to every conversation the player has with him. He is one of the last surviving members of a group that was involved in one of the most morally significant events in the series' history, carrying that history with him in ways that he addresses differently depending on whether the player pursues that aspect of his story. The option to pursue it, or not to, is one of the ways New Vegas rewards players who have played the earlier games without requiring that knowledge to have a satisfying experience. The followers of the Apocalypse companion Arcade Gannon carries a similar weight of suppressed history. He is the son of Enclave soldiers, raised in the wasteland after the Enclave's defeat, who became a doctor with the followers specifically to work against everything his parents' organization represented. His Enclave background is something he has kept private for years, and the player's ability to discover it and choose what to do with that knowledge, whether to use it against him, to accept it as part of his history, or to help him achieve a kind of closure with it, is one of New Vegas's more accomplished character arcs. The game trusts the player to recognize that a person is not their parents' sins. The story of the Boomers, the isolated community living at Nellis Air Force Base in the Mojave, protected by artillery that they use to keep the outside world at a specific distance, is one of New Vegas's most complete pieces of community portraiture. The Boomers know very little about the world beyond their perimeter. Their mythology of the outside is a collection of fears and misconceptions accumulated over generations of isolation. Their understanding of their own history is filtered through 2 centuries of oral tradition and technical culture focused entirely on maintaining the aircraft and weapons that define their identity. They are, in a specific way, the most fully formed example in the series of what happens when a community decides that the outside world cannot be trusted and acts accordingly for long enough that the decision becomes part of who they are. The culmination of the Boomers' questline, which involves helping them recover and restore a Second World War era aircraft from the depths of Lake Mead, is one of the series' most unexpected emotional payoffs. The restoration of the bomber, the preparation of a community for a moment of flight that their mythology has promised for generations, delivers something genuinely joyful in a game that is more often interested in ambiguity than joy. It is one of those moments in Fallout where the wasteland, despite everything, produces something that feels unambiguously good, a community achieving something they built their entire identity around achieving, in a world that rarely allows anyone to simply succeed at the thing they most wanted. The water that flows through the wasteland, and more importantly, the water that does not flow, the contaminated sources and the dry beds and the settlements that have built their entire existence around a single functioning purifier, is one of the series' most consistent resources of narrative tension. Clean water in the Fallout world is not a convenience, but a survival question, and control over water sources is one of the fundamental drivers of political conflict at every scale, from a single settlement to a civilization spanning conflict. The Mojave Wasteland's relationship to Hoover Dam is ultimately a relationship to the water and power the dam can provide. The Capital Wasteland's Project Purity storyline is a conflict over the capacity to provide clean water at scale. The Commonwealth's settlements live in constant awareness of their water supply. Water is the oldest political resource in human history, and Fallout understands that completely. Project Purity, the research effort at the center of Fallout 3's main storyline, represents the most ambitious rebuilding project visible in any Fallout game. The attempt to purify the Potomac River on a scale sufficient to provide clean water to the entire Capital Wasteland. The project was initiated by the player's father, whose disappearance drives the game's early narrative, and whose history with the project provides a through line connecting the player's personal story to the Wasteland's largest political conflict. The Enclave's interest in Project Purity is not simply military. It is specifically interested in controlling the mechanism of water purification, the capacity to determine who has access to clean water in a world where that access is life itself. The Aqua Pura trucks that roll through the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3's Broken Steel DLC, distributing the purified water from Project Purity to settlements throughout the region, are one of the series' most quietly hopeful images. The trucks are not glamorous, the distribution process is imperfect, the wasteland around them has not changed. But the fact of the trucks, the actual movement of clean water outward from a central source to the people who need it, represents the first genuinely beneficial infrastructure project that the player's actions have produced on a wasteland-wide scale. It is rebuilding, slow and imperfect and real. The technical achievement of Project Purity, which required solving engineering and physics problems that the pre-war world had not finished solving, was accomplished through a combination of the father's decades of work and the player's intervention, using technology that the pre-war world had developed but not fully deployed. The game uses this achievement to make a specific argument about knowledge and legacy, that the work of the pre-war world was not simply destroyed along with everything else, that sufficient pieces of it survived in documents and memories in the minds of people who had studied it to allow something new to be built on its foundations. The old world's science continuing to serve the new world in the hands of people who choose to use it well. The night sky of the Fallout world, visible on clear nights through the game's atmospheric rendering, unchanged from our own sky because the stars are too far away to have been affected by what happened on Earth, is one of the small ironies of the series' sky rendering. The constellations visible from the Capital Wasteland and the Mojave and the Commonwealth, those are the same ones visible from the real versions of those places, because the bombs only changed what was on the ground. Looking up from the wasteland, the sky looks exactly as it did 200 years ago. The universe has not noticed what happened. Only everything beneath it has. This quality of the sky, its absolute indifference to what happened below it, its persistence as a thing unchanged by the changed world, is one of the places where the Fallout games touch something that is genuinely philosophical without appearing to be. The stars are the same. The days are still 24 hours long. The seasons still turn, albeit with disruptions from the changes in atmospheric composition. The Earth continues to orbit the Sun with complete indifference to the fact that something terrible happened on its surface. There is comfort in this, of a very specific and cold kind. The comfort of scale, of perspective, of the recognition that even the worst things that happen on Earth happen on a planet that is itself a small object in an enormous universe that will continue whether or not civilization on this particular planet makes it. The Fallout universe will keep producing new corners to explore, new vaults to discover, new communities to encounter, new facts both significant and useless, new details that are either intentional or accidental, and that players will assign meaning to regardless. The world was built with enough internal consistency and enough care that it can sustain expansion without collapsing into incoherence. And the people who care about it, the developers who add to it, and the players who carry it forward in their memories and discussions and creative work, are continuing a project that began with a small team in the 1990s who wanted to build something that felt genuinely large. The facts arrive tonight from many different places in that large world, from the terminals and the holotapes, from the developers who made it, and the players who found things the developers did not know were there, from the fiction and from the history that the fiction refracted. They settle together into a kind of map, not the complete map of the wasteland that the Pip-Boy produces through exploration, but a map of what the wasteland is made of, the layers of intention and accident, craft and humor, sorrow and resilience that together produce a world worth spending time in. The lore of Fallout carries within it something of the quality of oral tradition, the kind of knowledge that passes from person to person, that grows in the telling, that accumulates the marks of everyone who has engaged with it. A player who spent 100 hours in the wasteland 15 years ago carries certain images and facts and feelings forward in their memory in ways that have become genuinely personal, mixed with their own experience of that particular time and those particular hours. The Fallout world has become, for a significant number of people, part of their interior landscape, a place they can return to in memory with a specificity that fictional worlds rarely achieve. The Great War that ended the world of Fallout was not simply a nuclear exchange. It was the end of a particular way of imagining the future, the atomic age optimism that believed technology and progress were the same thing, that believed science would solve the problems it created, that believed the bright promise of the 1950s could be sustained indefinitely if everyone just kept their shelters stocked and their loyalty unquestioned. The bombs that fell on October 23rd ended that optimism in the most literal way available. The Vault Boys' thumbs up persists in the aftermath as a kind of memorial to the faith that produced it, cheerful long after the cheerfulness has any grounds. The survivalists and wanderers who move through the wasteland in every Fallout game are inheritors of something they cannot fully name, a world whose possibilities were foreclosed before most of them were born, a world defined by its endings as much as by its beginnings. They did not make the choice that ended the old world, but they live inside that choice and inside the long consequences of it, building what they can from what remains. There is something in their persistence, in the farmer who grows crops in irradiated soil, in the doctor who keeps a clinic running with salvaged pre war medicine, in the teacher who maintains a school in the ruins, that the Fallout games return to again and again as the argument for continuing. Not because the world is good, because people are still in it. The Fallout universe will continue to grow as long as there are people willing to add to it. New games, new stories, new corners of the wasteland that no one has explored yet. Each edition carries the risk of contradiction and the opportunity of enrichment, the tension between a world that needs to be coherent and a world that needs to remain open. The best Fallout lore has always lived in that tension, using the specific details of a deeply realized world as the foundation for questions that the world's edges do not fully answer. That openness is not a flaw. It is an invitation extended to everyone who has ever picked up a Pip-Boy and stepped out of a vault door into the particular quality of light that falls on a world beginning again. Tonight, wherever you are, the wasteland is very far away and also very close, present in the way that stories become present when you have spent enough time inside them. Let it rest quietly alongside you now as the night continues its work and as whatever remains of the day settles into the particular silence that precedes sleep.